My name is Miles Jackson. I am 69 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I believed I had secured a peaceful retirement. My son-in-law walked into my home, threw his heavy bags on my custom oak table, and told me to clear out. He said his family needed the best rooms, and it was my job to make space for them. I stood up slowly, gave him a calm smile, and told him to pack his bags. I thought that would be the end of his entitlement. I had no idea he was holding a piece of paper that would turn my sanctuary into a war zone. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant relative a lesson they will never forget. Let me tell you exactly how this nightmare started. The heavy oak door of my mountain cabin did not just open. It was kicked open violently. The loud thud echoed through the quiet living room, shattering the peace I had finally found after decades of hard work. I looked up from my leather armchair. Logan, my 34-year-old son-in-law, stormed into the room with my daughter Jada, trailing silently behind him. Logan was wearing his usual expensive tailored suit, looking entirely out of place in a rustic mountain setting. He did not bother to take off his muddy shoes, tracking dirt across the hand-woven rug my wife had bought. He marched straight to the center of the room and tossed his heavy leather duffel bag right onto the pristine glass of my coffee table. The glass groaned loudly under the sudden weight. I stared at the bag and then up at him, waiting for an explanation for this absolute lack of respect. Logan did not even offer a basic greeting. He crossed his arms, puffed out his chest, and spoke to me with a tone usually reserved for disobedient servants. "Listen up, old man," he demanded, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. "My parents and the rest of the Mercer family are coming up this weekend. All 20 of them. We are hosting a massive family reunion. You need to clear out of the master suite today and move your stuff down to the storage shed out back." I remained completely silent, processing his words. I looked past him to my daughter. Jada, the girl I had raised and protected my entire life, refused to meet my eyes. She stared intently at the floor, shifting uncomfortably and playing with her expensive wedding ring. She was completely complicit in this. Jada finally looked up and mumbled weakly, "Dad, just do what he says, please. It will only be for a few days. We really need everything to be perfect." Her weakness deeply disgusted me. Logan took my silence as submission and continued his arrogant rant. "This place is too big for you anyway," he sneered, looking around the room with blatant disgust. "You just sit around doing nothing all day. We are going to put this property to good use. It is basically our early inheritance anyway, so we are taking charge starting today. My parents get your room because they actually appreciate luxury and need the space. The rest of the family takes the guest rooms. You can stay in the shed and help with the catering when they arrive tomorrow morning. Try to make yourself useful for once, instead of taking up space." The sheer audacity of his words hung heavily in the air. This arrogant boy believed he could walk into my home and command me like a hired hand. I slowly uncrossed my legs and stood up from my chair. I am a tall man, and despite my age, I am still built like the engineer I spent my life being. I walked around the coffee table until I was standing inches away from him, forcing him to look up slightly. I gave him a very calm, completely cold smile. "I am going to give you exactly 5 seconds to take that bag off my table," I said, my voice low and dangerously steady, "and then you are going to pack your bags and get off my property." Logan had no idea who he was dealing with. He looked at me and saw an old, retired black man who liked to go fishing on the weekends. He thought I was soft. He thought this cabin was some lucky windfall or a generic asset to be seized. He did not know that I spent 40 years working as a chief structural engineer for one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the country. I did not get a trust fund. I did not inherit a single dime. I climbed scaffolding in freezing rain. I managed cutthroat contractors, and I dealt with corporate sharks who thought they were born to rule the world. I bought this land 20 years ago when it was nothing but dirt and pine trees. I poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and tears into building this cabin. I laid the foundation. I designed the structural framework. I paid for every wooden beam and every stone in that fireplace with my own labor. This place was my sanctuary. I built it for my late wife, Corinne. It was supposed to be our peaceful retreat away from the noise and greed of the city. Since she passed away, it has been the only place where I truly feel close to her. Every corner of this house holds a memory of the life we built together. Now, this entitled finance director who married my daughter thought he could just swoop in and claim my sanctuary as his own weekend resort. He honestly believed his privilege and his fancy job title gave him the right to erase my entire life of hard work. He had severely miscalculated the situation. I was not a fragile senior citizen waiting to fade away. I was a man who knew how to secure a foundation, and I knew exactly how to tear one down. The ground he thought he stood on was entirely mine. Instead of backing down or showing even a shred of respect, Logan simply let out a loud, mocking laugh. He looked at me as if I had just told a pathetic joke. "You really think you still call the shots around here?" he asked, a wicked smirk spreading across his face. He reached inside his designer jacket and pulled out a neatly folded legal document. He slapped it down hard on the glass table right next to his dirty bag. "Read it and weep, old man." I slowly picked up the paper. It was a formal power of attorney document. It explicitly granted Jada and Logan full legal control over the management of this property and all associated assets. I scanned the text, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Right there at the very bottom was my own signature. It was absolutely authentic. My mind raced backward, trying to figure out how this had happened. Then the horrible realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Last month I was in the hospital for a minor gallbladder surgery. I was heavily medicated and groggy. Jada had visited me holding a thick stack of hospital discharge papers and insurance forms. She had urgently asked me to sign them so I could go home. I trusted my daughter implicitly. I had signed the papers without reading every single page. She had slipped this legal document into the medical stack. Logan leaned in close, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "It is too late, old man," he whispered. "Jada already signed the property management rights over to me. You are nothing but a guest in our house now, so grab your things and head to the shed before I have the police escort you off the mountain entirely." The game of theft had officially begun. I slowly lowered the forged document and shifted my gaze away from Logan. I looked directly at Jada. The little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the daughter I had worked double shifts to send to an expensive private college, was standing right in front of me. She refused to meet my eyes. She stared at the floorboards as if the grain of the wood was suddenly the most fascinating thing in the entire world. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy, and toxic. I waited for her to speak up, to say it was a sick joke to snatch the paper from her husband and apologize for this massive disrespect. But she did absolutely nothing. She just stood there, hiding behind the man who was currently trying to steal my home right out from under me. My heart did not break in that moment. It simply turned to solid ice. The profound sense of betrayal washed over me, replacing any lingering fatherly affection with a cold, hard, and calculating clarity. She was no longer my little girl. She was a grown woman who had actively chosen to participate in a calculated scheme against her own father. I took a deep breath and demanded an explanation without raising my voice. "Look at me, Jada," I said. "Look me in the eye and tell me you agree with this." She finally lifted her head, and the expression on her face was a pathetic mixture of guilt and annoyance. She actually looked annoyed that I was making this difficult for her. "Dad, please do not make a huge scene out of this," she pleaded, stepping out from behind Logan. "We are just trying to help you. You are getting older, and managing a property this large is simply too much for you to handle alone. We are doing this for your own good." I stared at her in utter disbelief. "For my own good," I repeated. "I am 69 years old, Jada. Not 90. I run 10 miles a week and manage my own stock portfolio. I built this house with my own hands. What exactly do you think I need help with?" Logan stepped forward, wrapping a possessive arm around my daughter. "You forget things, old man," he interrupted. "You missed a property tax deadline last year. Jada is just stepping up as a responsible daughter to ensure your assets are protected. It is completely legal. We are the managers now." I remembered that tax deadline clearly. I had missed it by 2 days because I was in another state arranging the funeral for my younger brother. They were deliberately using my grief against me to paint a false picture of senility and incompetence. Jada nodded eagerly, agreeing with his absurd and insulting logic. "Exactly, Dad," she said, her voice gaining a false sense of confidence. "Logan knows how to handle real estate. He is a finance director. He is going to make sure this place is maximized. We can rent it out when we are not using it. It is just smart business. You should be thanking us for taking this massive burden off your shoulders so you can just relax." I felt a sudden surge of pure disgust. She was repeating his words like a brainwashed parrot. She had traded her integrity and her family loyalty for the illusion of high society status that Logan and his terrible family provided. Before I could dissect her ridiculous argument and put her in her place, a loud symphony of car horns erupted from the driveway. The blaring noise shattered the tense atmosphere inside the cabin. The Mercer family had arrived. I looked out the large front window and saw a convoy of 3 black luxury SUVs pulling into my driveway. The heavy tires crushed the pristine gravel I had just leveled last week. The doors swung open and a chaotic swarm of entitled people spilled out, laughing loudly and shouting over each other. They acted as if they had just arrived at a resort hotel they had rented for a wild weekend getaway. Logan smiled broadly, clapping his hands together in excitement. "Excellent, the whole family is finally here," he announced, turning back to me with a triumphant glare. "Remember what I said, old man. Head down to the shed and stay out of our way. We have a lot of unpacking to do, and we do not need you crowding the living space." I watched the chaotic scene outside my window while the harsh reality of their deception fully settled into my mind. I pieced together the events of the past month with the precision of the structural engineer I had always been. It was not just a spontaneous act of greed, it was a meticulously planned ambush designed to catch me at my weakest moment. 4 weeks ago, I was admitted to the hospital for a routine gallbladder removal surgery. The procedure was successful, but the heavy anesthesia and pain medication left me highly disoriented for a couple of days. Jada had visited me every single afternoon during my recovery. I thought she was being a devoted and loving daughter. She brought me hot soup, held my hand, and talked endlessly about how worried she had been for my health. On the day I was finally scheduled to be discharged, she walked into my hospital room holding a thick clipboard full of dense documents. She told me they were standard hospital release forms and complex insurance waivers that needed my immediate authorization. She pointed to the bottom of the pages telling me exactly where to sign so we could finally go home and I could rest in my own bed. I trusted her completely because she was my flesh and blood. I signed every single page she placed in front of me without bothering to put on my reading glasses or checking the fine print. She had carefully slipped that power of attorney document right into the middle of the medical stack. My own daughter had weaponized my illness, my grogginess, and my absolute trust to steal the very roof over my head. Corinne, my late wife, had always warned me about this. She saw things I refused to see. Corinne always said that Jada's desperation to fit in with the wealthy elite and her constant need for validation would eventually corrupt her morals. I never wanted to believe it. I always wanted to see the best in my child. But standing here now, looking at that forged signature on a stolen document, I realized Corinne had been absolutely right all along. The sweet daughter we raised was entirely gone, replaced by a stranger blinded by greed and shallow ambition. She had sold me out for the approval of a family that did not even respect her. The heavy front door swung open again, and Richard Mercer walked in. Richard was Logan's father, a man who carried himself with the unearned arrogance of someone who had inherited all his wealth and never worked a hard day in his life. He wore a crisp polo shirt and expensive loafers, looking around my custom-built cabin with a critical, judgmental eye. He did not bother to greet me or even acknowledge my existence as a human being. He looked at me the way one looks at a piece of broken furniture that needs to be hauled away to the dump. "Ah, the rustic charm," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "It will need a complete remodel, but the land has some decent potential." Patricia, his equally awful wife, walked in behind him, complaining about the mountain air ruining her hair. Richard then walked directly toward me, stopping just a few feet away. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy set of car keys, and tossed them casually at my chest. I caught them out of pure reflex before they hit the floor. "Hey, buddy," he said with a condescending smirk, using a tone you would use on a valet at a restaurant. "The black SUV is blocking the driveway. Park it around the side and then start bringing our luggage up to the master bedroom. Make sure you do not scratch the leather bags, they cost more than you make in a year." Logan and Jada stood there watching the entire interaction. Logan was grinning from ear to ear, clearly enjoying my profound humiliation. Jada looked away again, too cowardly to intervene or defend her own father. They fully expected me to yell, to throw the keys back in his face, and cause a massive scene that they could record and use as definitive proof of my mental instability. But I did not give them that satisfaction. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply closed my hand around the heavy keys, gave Richard a blank, emotionless stare, and turned toward the door. I walked out into the cold mountain air, heading straight for his luxury vehicle. but I had absolutely no intention of parking his car or carrying his expensive bags. As soon as I was out of their sight, I reached into the deep pocket of my jacket and switched on the micro voice recorder. It was a habit I kept from my days negotiating with corrupt contractors on massive building sites. I always recorded hostile interactions. The game of theft had escalated, and they had absolutely no idea that I was already holding all the winning cards. I walked out to the driveway and left Richard's heavy car keys sitting right on the hood of his pristine luxury SUV. I did not park his car, and I certainly did not touch a single piece of his expensive luggage. I walked around the wraparound porch, taking deliberate and steady steps toward the side entrance of my cabin to grab a few essential items from the mudroom. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the sun dipped behind the tall pines, casting long, dark shadows across the property. I reached out with cold fingers to punch in my standard 6-digit code on the smart lock keypad. The keypad flashed a bright, angry red and let out a harsh error beep. I paused, thinking my fingers had simply slipped in the biting wind. I carefully typed the numbers again. Another red flash and another loud, obnoxious beep. Access denied. The heavy deadbolt remained firmly in place, locking me out of the home I had built from the ground up. I looked up at the small security camera mounted above the door, feeling a deep chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. A moment later, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Logan. It read, "I updated the security codes for our safety. The shed out back is unlocked. Have a good night, old man." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words over and over again. He had intentionally locked me out of my own home in the freezing cold, forcing a 69-year-old man to sleep in an unheated wooden storage unit. It was a calculated act of physical and psychological cruelty. I stood on the porch for a long moment, letting the biting wind hit my face and bite through my light jacket. Through the large living room windows, I could see the warm golden light spilling out onto the deck. I could see shadows moving inside. The Mercer family was already making themselves completely at home, taking over the space like a swarm of well-dressed locusts. I turned my back on the warm cabin and headed down the dirt path toward the large storage shed I had built a decade ago to hold my tools and heavy landscaping equipment. I pushed open the creaky wooden door and stepped into the dark, dusty space. The air inside was stale and smelled strongly of motor oil, dried paint, and sawdust. It was bitterly cold, the uninsulated walls offering zero protection from the mountain elements. I flipped the switch, turning on the single bare overhead bulb that bathed the room in a harsh yellow glow. Logan had not bothered to prepare anything for me. There was no bed, no space heater, and no blankets. I was expected to sleep on the hard concrete floor like a stray animal. I walked over to a stack of plastic storage bins and pulled out a few old moving blankets I kept for transporting lumber. I arranged them over a stack of flattened cardboard boxes in the corner to create a makeshift mattress. I sat down on the cold cardboard, pulling my jacket tight around me and rubbing my hands together to generate some meager heat. From up the hill, I could hear the muffled sounds of loud, bass-heavy music and raucous laughter echoing from my cabin. They had fired up my expensive outdoor grill, and I could smell the rich scent of the premium steaks I had bought for myself earlier that week. I could hear Richard's booming voice boasting loudly about some country club golf tournament, while Patricia shrieked with laughter, complaining about the lack of cellular service on the mountain. They were celebrating their hostile takeover with absolute zero remorse. They were drinking my vintage wine, eating my food, and sleeping in the custom oak bed I had built for my late wife, Corinne. The utter disrespect and sheer arrogance of the situation was enough to make a weaker man storm up there, break a window, and demand his home back. But I stayed seated on my cardboard bed, breathing in the freezing air and controlling my heart rate. I was not a man who reacted with mindless, unpredictable anger. I was a man who calculated load-bearing limits, structural vulnerabilities, and stress points. Logan thought he had completely isolated me and stripped me of all my power by locking me in a wooden box in the backyard. He thought he was the smartest guy in the room, playing a high-stakes game of real estate chess against a senile and helpless old fool. He had no idea that he had just locked himself inside a technological trap of my own flawless design. What Logan and Jada completely failed to understand was the true depth of my professional expertise. When I told them I was a structural engineer, I kept things incredibly simple for their narrow, privileged minds. During my 40 years in commercial real estate development, I did not just design steel beams and pour concrete foundations. I oversaw the integration of advanced security networks for massive corporate skyscrapers and government facilities. I specialized in creating invisible surveillance grids that protected billions of dollars in highly sensitive corporate assets. When I built this cabin 20 years ago, I did not just hire some local general contractor to slap a basic alarm system on the doors and windows. I personally wired the entire property from the inside out. I installed military-grade microcameras inside the air vents behind the custom woodwork and integrated them directly into the masonry of the stone fireplace. I built a highly secure closed-loop network that ran on a completely separate hidden server located right here inside this very shed. I originally built the system to ensure Corinne's absolute safety when I was forced to travel for long corporate projects. It was my way of watching over her when I could not be there physically. Logan thought he was a brilliant tech genius for using a smartphone app to change the password on a basic front door smart lock. He had absolutely no idea that every single room in that cabin was currently transmitting crystal clear high-definition audio and video directly to my private server. He thought he had kicked me out of the house and blinded me to his actions. In reality, he had just placed himself perfectly inside my observation deck where I could monitor his every move, his every word, and his every mistake. I stood up from my cardboard bed and walked to the back of the shed. I reached behind a heavy stack of old paint cans and pulled away a false wooden panel on the wall that blended perfectly with the surrounding timber. Behind it was a heavy-duty locked metal lockbox recessed directly into the framing. I punched in a physical 12-digit code and pulled the heavy door open, revealing a high-powered laptop and a dedicated server bank humming quietly in the cold air. I booted up the computer and logged into my master control interface, bypassing 3 layers of encrypted security. The large screen instantly populated with a dozen live camera feeds from inside the cabin. I could see absolutely everything. I saw Patricia snooping through Corinne's old jewelry boxes in the master bedroom, tossing aside pieces she deemed cheap. I saw Richard pouring himself a massive glass of my rarest scotch in the kitchen, drinking it like it was cheap tap water. But it was the high-definition feed from the main living room that caught my complete and undivided attention. Logan was pacing back and forth in front of the large stone fireplace, holding his cell phone tight to his ear. He looked intensely anxious and frantic, completely different from the arrogant boy who had kicked my door open earlier that afternoon. He was sweating heavily and chewing on his thumbnail. I isolated the audio feed from the fireplace microphone and cranked up the volume to catch every single word. Logan was speaking to someone in a hushed, panicked tone. "Yes, I absolutely understand the deadline," he said, rubbing his forehead aggressively. "The collateral is fully secured, I promise you. I am standing in the property right now. It is a custom luxury cabin worth at least $3 million on the open market, maybe more. I have the power of attorney fully executed and legally signed by the owner. We can proceed with the $2 million commercial loan immediately. I need those funds wired to my investment group by Monday morning, or we are completely bankrupt and facing federal audits. Do you hear me? Monday morning." I stared at the glowing screen as the sheer magnitude of his crime washed over me in the freezing shed. Logan was not just moving his awful family in for a free weekend vacation. His highly touted finance company was collapsing under the weight of his own incompetence, and he was using my home as collateral for a $2 million fraudulent loan to save his own skin and avoid prison. He was stealing my life's work to pay for his massive failures. I leaned back in my chair, a cold smile creeping across my face. The game was no longer about a stolen cabin. It was about federal wire fraud. The morning mountain air was razor-sharp, biting through the thin gaps in the uninsulated shed walls. I was already awake, wrapped in my heavy jacket and staring at the glowing array of hidden monitors when the heavy deadbolt on the shed door rattled violently. I quickly powered down the main screens, leaving only a benign black screensaver running before Jada stepped inside. She was holding a flimsy paper plate covered with cheap aluminum foil. She did not look like the confident, successful daughter I raised. She looked exhausted, her eyes darting nervously around the dusty space as if she were terrified her new in-laws might see her interacting with her own father. She shoved the plate toward my chest without making eye contact. "I brought you some breakfast," she muttered, her voice tight and defensive. "It is just some leftover pancakes and eggs from the catering spread," Logan ordered for everyone. "Please, just eat it and stay quiet today, Dad. Do not come up to the main house and do not make a scene. Logan's parents are already stressed about the high altitude, and the very last thing I need is you embarrassing me in front of them. Try to show some gratitude that we are even letting you stay on the property." I slowly took the flimsy paper plate from her shaking hands. The food was ice cold, the pancakes stiff, and the eggs rubbery and unappetizing. It was the literal scraps from the table of the people who had forcefully invaded my sanctuary. I looked down at the pathetic meal and then looked back up at the grown woman standing before me. I did not yell, and I did not throw the plate back at her face. I simply peeled back the foil, took a slow, deliberate bite of the cold bread and chewed it in complete silence while staring directly into her eyes. The heavy silence stretched out, making her increasingly uncomfortable. She crossed her arms, defensive and highly impatient, tapping her expensive leather boots against the concrete floor. "What is that look supposed to mean?" she snapped, her voice cracking slightly. "We are dealing with a lot right now, Dad. Logan is under immense pressure with his investment firm, and we are trying to manage your assets before you run this entire place into the ground due to your age. You should be thanking him for stepping up." Without waiting for my response, she turned on her expensive heels and marched out of the shed, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind her. The loud sound echoed in the small space, sealing me back into my cold wooden cage. I set the plate aside untouched. The time for fatherly patience and understanding had officially expired. I turned back to the false wall and booted up my hidden server bank. The hardware I had stashed away in this shed was not just for monitoring security cameras. It was a fully functional command center built from surplus enterprise-grade components I had salvaged from corporate demolition projects over my long career. I activated a powerful network scanning tool I had coded myself, specifically designed to monitor and intercept all traffic on my cabin's local area network. When Logan changed the smart lock password on the front door, he completely failed to realize that the entire wireless router system was still tethered to my primary administrative node. He was proudly surfing the web, conducting his fraudulent business and syncing his mobile devices on a network that I totally controlled from the shadows. I watched his laptop's IP address pop up on my tracking software like a glowing red beacon. He was incredibly careless, leaving his basic firewall disabled and his file-sharing ports wide open. It took me less than 3 minutes to bypass his basic user passwords and gain full remote administrative access to his entire hard drive. I began pulling down gigabytes of his personal and professional data directly into my secure encrypted server. I was not just looking for evidence of the bank loan anymore. I was looking to completely dismantle his entire life piece by piece and ruin his future. I sat in the freezing shed watching the progress bar fill up on my monitor. Every single document he thought was hidden was now firmly in my grasp. The arrogance of youth is always underestimating the quiet patience of age. Logan thought his corporate background made him untouchable, but he was playing in a digital sandbox I had helped construct decades ago. I meticulously categorized his emails, his bank statements, and his hidden liabilities. I was building a solid, airtight cage around him without him even realizing the walls were closing in. As the encrypted files downloaded into my server, I began to piece together the pathetic reality of Logan's so-called financial empire. For the past 5 years, the Mercer family had paraded around high society country clubs, boasting endlessly about their elite investment fund. They drove leased luxury vehicles, wore designer clothes, bought on massive credit lines, and threw lavish, extravagant parties to project an image of untouchable generational wealth. But the internal spreadsheets and hidden accounting logs I was unearthing told a completely different and devastating story. The Mercer Fund was a spectacular, catastrophic failure. Logan had made a series of incredibly arrogant and disastrous bets on commercial retail spaces right before the real estate market dramatically shifted. His firm was currently bleeding capital at an unsustainable and alarming rate. He owed millions to aggressive private investors, and his corporate accounts were critically overdrawn, facing imminent default. The lavish lifestyle they were flaunting in my cabin was nothing more than a desperate hollow facade built entirely on mounting debt and constant lies. They were completely broke. Richard Mercer, the man who had tossed his car keys at my chest like I was a low-level peasant, had quietly filed for silent bankruptcy 2 years ago to dodge his creditors. Logan was desperately trying to secure this $2 million commercial loan using my unencumbered $3 million cabin as collateral just to cover his immediate margin calls and avoid federal prosecution for misappropriating his clients' funds. My mountain property was the absolute only life raft keeping this pathetic family of arrogant frauds from drowning in the financial ruin they had created for themselves. I was not just dealing with entitled, annoying relatives throwing a party. I was dealing with desperate, cornered criminals who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to steal from me. I continued sifting through his heavily unorganized directories, opening private folders labeled with aggressive corporate acronyms and shady banking terms. Then a specific file name caught my eye, standing out drastically from the sea of dry financial documents. It was a highly classified PDF document sitting in a hidden subfolder labeled Legal Contingencies. The file was simply named Medical Record Miles Jackson. My blood ran completely cold as I double-clicked the file and watched the digital document load on my large screen. It was a formal diagnostic report bearing the official letterhead of a prominent private psychiatric clinic located in the city. I scanned the pages rapidly, reading the clinical descriptions of my supposed mental state. The fabricated report detailed severe memory loss, erratic behavioral outbursts, aggressive physical tendencies, and a complete inability to manage basic personal hygiene or complex financial responsibilities. I scrolled down to the final page where the concluding diagnosis was stamped in bold black letters. Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease. The signature at the very bottom belonged to a Dr. Eris Thorne, a highly expensive and notoriously unethical specialist known for catering to wealthy, desperate clients. I had never met this man in my entire life. I had never once stepped foot inside his expensive clinic. Yet here was a legally binding document detailing my rapid mental decline and explicitly recommending that my son-in-law, Logan Mercer, be granted immediate and permanent legal guardianship over my person and my entire estate. Logan had not just forged a simple power of attorney. He had purchased a fraudulent medical diagnosis to completely erase my civil rights and strip me of my autonomy. He was actively planning to lock me away in a secure psychiatric facility while he drained my life savings to pay off his massive debts. I leaned forward in the freezing shed, staring at the forged signature on the screen. The game had just escalated from property theft to outright kidnapping. They were trying to erase me from society so they could freely consume everything I had spent a lifetime building. I clenched my fists until my knuckles turned white. My breathing slowed as a deep, chilling resolve settled over me. I was not going to simply defend my property anymore. I was going to utterly destroy them and ensure they never had the power to victimize anyone else ever again. The trap was set, and Logan was blindly walking right into it. The afternoon sun baked the mountain air as the Mercer family moved their lavish party out to the massive wooden deck I had built by hand. The heavy scent of expensive Wagyu beef and imported cigars drifted down to my cold storage shed. I watched them through the security cameras, playing the part of the perfect wealthy family. Logan was holding court near the stainless steel grill, holding a glass of scotch and laughing loudly. The heavy wooden door to my shed creaked open again. This time it was not Jada. Logan stood in the doorway, blocking the sunlight. He had a smug, twisted smile on his face. "Come on out, old man," he commanded, waving his hand dismissively. "We have a special guest who wants to meet you. It would be rude to keep you locked up all day." I stepped out of the dark shed and blinked against the bright sunlight. Standing next to Logan on the manicured lawn was a tall, thin white man in a tailored linen suit holding an expensive leather briefcase. He had cold, calculating eyes that scanned me from head to toe. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne." Logan announced, his voice dripping with fake concern. "He is a very close family friend who came all the way up here just to check on your health today." Dr. Thorne stepped forward and offered a soft, clammy hand. It was the exact same man whose forged signature was at the bottom of my fake Alzheimer diagnosis. I took his hand and immediately forced my own fingers to tremble violently. I let my shoulders slump forward, adopting the posture of a frail, confused, and highly vulnerable old man. "Hello, Miles," Dr. Thorne said, speaking to me in a slow, exaggerated tone usually reserved for toddlers or the severely impaired. "Logan tells me you have been having some trouble remembering things lately. How are we feeling today?" I looked around the yard, acting as if I was completely disoriented by the noise and the crowd of arrogant strangers. "Who are all these people?" I mumbled, my voice shaking perfectly. "Why are they in my house?" I thought Corinne was making dinner tonight. Mentioning my late wife as if she were still alive was a calculated move. I saw Logan exchange a highly satisfied smirk with the corrupt doctor. Dr. Thorne pulled a small notepad from his jacket pocket and clicked a silver pen. "Corinne passed away 5 years ago, Miles," he said slowly, watching my reaction like a hawk. "Do you know what year it is right now? Can you tell me who the current president is?" He was rapidly firing standard cognitive assessment questions at me outside of a clinical setting without any medical authorization. He was building his fraudulent case right in front of my face, trying to goad me into an aggressive outburst. If I yelled or demanded he leave my property, he would document it as paranoid aggression. If I refused to speak, he would document it as catatonic withdrawal. I played his sick game flawlessly. I stuttered heavily, mispronounced basic words, and pretended I could not remember Logan's name, calling him the loud boy. I let a thin line of drool pool at the corner of my mouth. I stared blankly at the trees and asked if it was time to go to work at the factory. I gave them an absolute masterclass in senile dementia. Dr. Thorne nodded sympathetically while scribbling furiously on his notepad. "It is okay, Miles," he whispered, placing a patronizing hand on my shoulder. "We are going to get you the specialized help you desperately need. You are not going to have to worry about taking care of yourself or your finances ever again. Logan and Jada are going to make sure you are kept totally safe in a secure medical facility." The sheer evil of their plan was staggering to witness in person. They were standing in my yard, drinking my alcohol, and actively plotting to strip away my fundamental human rights. They thought I was a broken vessel ready to be discarded into a locked ward. They looked at my skin color, my age, and my dusty clothes and assumed I was a helpless target who lacked the resources to fight back. They completely failed to realize the vast network of power I had spent 40 years cultivating in the shadows of the commercial real estate world. When you manage billion-dollar construction projects across the country, you do not just work with local architects and plumbers. You build deep, lifelong relationships with corporate sharks, ruthless defense attorneys, and aggressive federal investigators. I knew exactly what Dr. Thorne and Logan were doing, and I knew the exact legal statutes they were blatantly violating. Falsifying a medical diagnostic report for financial gain is a severe federal offense. Conspiracy to commit medical fraud and elder abuse carries mandatory minimum sentencing. Identity theft and wire fraud added another decade to the equation. I was mentally calculating their federal prison sentences while they thought I was struggling to remember what day of the week it was. I had a team of elite legal professionals who owed me massive favors just waiting for my signal to strike. I did not need to scream or throw punches to defend myself against these arrogant fools. I just needed to let them thoroughly document their own catastrophic crimes. Every note Dr. Thorne took and every lie Logan told was simply another nail in their collective coffin. They were digging a legal grave so incredibly deep they would never see the sun again. The medical license Dr. Thorne relied on to make his dirty money was going to be shredded, and Logan was going to face the absolute full wrath of the Federal Banking Commission. They thought their white privilege and fake wealth made them untouchable in a system designed to crush people who looked like me. But I had spent a lifetime learning how to use that exact same system to absolutely obliterate my enemies. Logan patted Dr. Thorne on the back and gestured toward the outdoor bar. "Come get a drink, Eris," he laughed loudly. "The old man is clearly checked out and completely gone. Jada can watch him while we celebrate your visit." Dr. Thorne smiled, setting his expensive leather briefcase down on a small wooden side table next to the shed. As soon as the two men turned their backs and walked toward the loud crowd on the deck, I instantly dropped the confused old man act. My trembling hands became perfectly steady. My clouded eyes turned sharp and utterly focused. I moved with a rapid, silent efficiency that would have terrified them. I reached into my deep jacket pocket and pulled out a microscopic GPS tracker and audio transmitter I had salvaged from my high-end security supplies. I quickly unlatched the brass buckle on Dr. Thorne's leather bag and slipped the tiny black device deep into the lining of an interior pocket. I snapped the bag shut and stepped back into my slumped posture just a second before Jada walked over to check on me. She looked at me with total disgust and told me to go back inside the shed before I ruined their afternoon. I shuffled back into the dark, dusty room and closed the heavy door behind me. I immediately dropped the act and walked straight to my hidden server bank. The tracker was already transmitting a flawless audio signal and pinpoint location data directly to my computer. I reached under the floorboards and pulled out an untraceable burner phone I kept for extreme emergencies. I typed in a highly secure encrypted number belonging to my personal attorney. I stared at the glowing screen and typed a single message. "Sullivan, initiate the spiderweb protocol." I hit send. The trap was now permanently locked. The relentless morning sun pierced through the dusty windows of the main garage, casting long, bright beams across the polished concrete floor. I was already awake, standing quietly by the side door, when I heard the heavy crunch of gravel approaching the property. A flashy flatbed tow truck aggressively backed into my driveway, crushing the newly laid stones. Logan marched out of the cabin holding a cup of artisan coffee and leading a greasy-looking man in a cheap suit straight toward my garage. Logan punched the access code into the keypad, and the massive bay doors rolled open with a loud mechanical hum. I stepped out of the shadows to see what new level of theft he had planned for the day. Sitting under a custom canvas tarp in the very center of the pristine garage was my vintage '68 Ford Mustang. It was polished to an absolute mirror finish and completely untouched by the mountain dust. Logan walked right up to the tarp and yanked it off with a dramatic sweep, revealing the gleaming cherry red paint. He pointed at my vehicle and told the strange man that he needed cash immediately to fund the rest of the weekend catering and luxury alcohol. He was selling my car right out from under me to pay for a fake rich lifestyle he could no longer afford. The sheer audacity of his actions was reaching a staggering new level of criminal behavior. The greasy man walked slowly around the vintage car, running his dirty hands over the custom paint job and inspecting the pristine chrome bumpers. He looked at Logan and offered a ridiculously low number, a tiny fraction of what the pristine classic was actually worth on the open market. Logan did not even bother to negotiate or ask for a fair price. He just laughed his arrogant laugh and told the man he would take the cash transfer right on the spot as long as the car was gone today. I stepped forward out of the shadows, making my physical presence known in the large space. Logan rolled his eyes and sighed heavily, acting as if I was a stray dog that had wandered into his high-end showroom. He told the buyer to ignore the old man, pointing a highly dismissive finger directly at my chest. He declared that I was just a broke freeloader who had been living off his wife's family for years, and he insisted that I did not own anything here anymore. He proudly proclaimed that he was the legal owner of this entire estate and everything inside it, including this garage space. The buyer looked slightly uncomfortable, looking back and forth between me and the arrogant boy in the tailored suit. His intense greed quickly overpowered any moral hesitation he might have had about the shady transaction. Logan pulled out the forged power of attorney document again, waving it around like a magic wand that gave him absolute permission to strip my life bare. He signed a blank bill of sale, transferring ownership of my vehicle directly to the stranger. He grabbed a pen and forged my name right there on the hood of my own car, pressing hard into the metal. I watched his eyes scan the cash. He sneered at me and told me that this money would finally be used for something worthwhile instead of gathering dust. He told me that my era was over, and it was time for the new generation to take the reins. I stood perfectly still with my arms crossed tightly over my chest. I did not shout, and I did not try to physically stop them from taking the vehicle. The buyer handed Logan a thick envelope of $100 bills and told his driver to hook the Mustang up to the flatbed truck. Logan counted the money with a sickening grin on his face, looking at me as if he had just conquered the world. He told me I should be grateful he was getting rid of the old junk taking up space in his new garage so he could park his luxury SUV inside. Logan looked at the car and saw a piece of old metal he could quickly liquidate to buy more expensive liquor for his pathetic fake rich parents. He had absolutely no idea what that cherry red Mustang actually represented to me and my family. I did not buy that car for myself. I bought it 30 years ago for my late wife, Corinne. It was her absolute dream car, and she treated it like a member of the family. She used to drive it down the coastal highways with the windows rolled down, the radio playing her favorite soul music while she sang at the top of her lungs. When she got sick and could no longer drive, I spent every single weekend in this exact garage, restoring the engine and polishing the chrome just to see her smile when she looked out the bedroom window. That car was a holy relic of the woman I loved more than anything in this world. It was a tangible piece of her vibrant spirit that I had fiercely protected since the day she passed away. Taking my cabin was an act of financial desperation and greedy entitlement that I was willing to handle with cold legal precision. Putting his filthy hands on Corinne's car and selling it to a sleazy stranger for weekend party funds crossed a fatal and unforgivable boundary. He had just signed his own absolute death warrant in my eyes. I was entirely willing to let the legal system handle his financial crimes and put him in a white-collar prison for wire fraud. Touching her memory meant I was going to ensure he never knew a single day of peace for the rest of his miserable life. The rage inside me evolved from a slow burn into an absolute freezing zero clarity. He was no longer just a thief, he was a target marked for complete annihilation. I watched in total silence as the tow truck driver secured the heavy steel chains to the undercarriage of Corinne's beautiful car. The loud clanking of the metal echoed in the empty garage like a solemn funeral bell, ringing out a final warning. The greasy buyer shook Logan's hand one last time and climbed into the passenger seat of the massive tow truck. As the truck slowly rumbled down my long gravel driveway, carrying a massive piece of my heart away, Logan turned to me with a wicked, arrogant smile. He patted the thick envelope of cash hidden in his tailored jacket pocket and told me to go clean the guest bathrooms before the rest of his loud family woke up. He turned his back and strutted confidently toward the warm cabin, completely oblivious to the catastrophic legal mistake he had just made. As soon as he was out of sight, I pulled the hidden burner phone from my deep jacket pocket. I zoomed in and snapped a crystal-clear, high-definition photograph of the tow truck's license plate and the business logo printed on the side of the door. Then I walked over to the wooden workbench where Logan had carelessly tossed the carbon copy of the fraudulent bill of sale. I photographed the document, clearly capturing his forged signature next to my printed name. I opened my encrypted messaging application and sent both images directly to my personal attorney, Sullivan. I typed a brief, highly specific message underneath the photos. I wrote that Logan Mercer just sold a stolen vehicle across state lines using forged documents, and I instructed him to add grand theft auto and interstate trafficking of stolen goods to the federal indictment list. I knew that the federal authorities would look at this transaction and immediately identify it as a major felony. Stealing a classic car worth six figures and selling it for quick cash was the exact kind of sloppy desperation that aggressive prosecutors love to tear apart in federal court. Logan thought he had outsmarted a helpless old man, but he was literally handing me the concrete evidence I needed to lock him inside a federal penitentiary for the next decade of his life. The trap was springing shut faster and harder than I had ever anticipated, and Logan was doing all the heavy lifting for me. The midday sun beat down on the mountain, but the atmosphere up on the main deck was rapidly turning freezing. I sat at my hidden surveillance terminal in the shed, watching the live, high-definition feeds with calculated patience. The Grand Mercer family reunion was supposed to feature a lavish 5-course meal right about now. Logan had hired a premium private catering company from the city using the thick envelope of cash he had just stolen from selling my late wife's classic Mustang. I watched him pace back and forth on the expansive wooden deck, his phone pressed tightly against his ear. His face was turning a violent shade of red, contrasting sharply with his crisp white designer shirt. The catering trucks were supposed to arrive over an hour ago. Through the outdoor microphone, I heard him yelling at the event coordinator. "What do you mean you cannot get through the lower gate?" he shouted, his voice cracking with sheer frustration. "Just punch in the access code and drive up the hill. Do not tell me the road is closed. I own this entire property." He hung up the phone and slammed his fist hard against the wooden railing. The 20 hungry and highly entitled Mercer family members were sitting around empty decorated tables complaining loudly about the lack of service. Richard Mercer was tapping his empty crystal glass demanding his lunch. Patricia was fanning herself dramatically, acting as if she were starving to death. Logan needed someone to blame for this highly embarrassing failure, and I knew exactly who he was coming for. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy wooden door of my shed was kicked open for the second time that weekend. Logan stood in the doorway, breathing heavily with his fists clenched aggressively at his sides. He marched straight toward me, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "What did you do to the main gate down at the bottom of the mountain?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal roof. "The catering trucks are stuck at the checkpoint. The electronic keypad is completely locked out, and the manual override is not accepting my inputs. You tampered with the control panel, did you not, old man? You are trying to ruin this important weekend out of pure spite." I remained seated on my makeshift cardboard bed, projecting absolute calm while he completely unraveled in front of me. I did not touch the gate. "Logan," I replied evenly, maintaining steady eye contact. "The electronic access codes reset automatically for unauthorized commercial users. You should know how to fix it since you are supposedly the legal and brilliant manager of this entire estate." He stepped closer, towering over me in a desperate attempt to use his physical size for intimidation. "Listen to me very closely, you broke, pathetic old fool," he hissed, spit flying from his lips. "My parents are hungry. My important investors are arriving soon and they are annoyed. If you do not give me the master override code for that gate right this second, I will drag you by your collar and throw you off this mountain myself." Jada appeared in the doorway looking panicked and thoroughly embarrassed by her husband's explosive tantrum. "Logan, please stop," she pleaded weakly, grabbing his tense arm. "Maybe the power grid is just out down there in the valley. We can just drive down in the SUV and personally escort the catering trucks up the hill." Logan snatched his arm away from her, gripping his phone tightly until his knuckles turned white. "No," he snapped, glaring at her. "I am not driving 5 miles down a dirt road like some lowly delivery boy." This old man deliberately sabotaged the security grid to embarrass me in front of my family. I looked past him directly to my daughter, analyzing her miserable posture. "Are you enjoying your luxurious weekend getaway, Jada?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of any fatherly warmth or sympathy. "Your successful husband seems to be having a lot of trouble managing his newly acquired empire." Logan lunged forward, kicking a heavy plastic storage bin violently out of his way. "Tell me the master code right now," he roared. I stood up slowly, unfolding my tall frame and matching his height, forcing him to take a sudden half-step backward. I gave him a cold, dead stare that carried 40 years of corporate boardroom battles. "There is no code, Logan," I stated simply. "The gate is not broken, and the power is not out. It is legally closed to all commercial traffic. You cannot authorize those heavy trucks to drive up that road because you do not own it." Logan stared at me as if I had just spoken a completely foreign language. He let out a loud, condescending scoff, running a frantic hand through his expensive, styled hair. "What kind of senile Alzheimer nonsense are you talking about now?" he mocked, trying to regain his false sense of superiority. "I have the signed deed to the cabin and the property lines fully mapped out. The private driveway connects directly to the main county highway. I own the access routes, and I authorize whoever I want." This was the fatal flaw of entitled, arrogant men who bought their degrees and faked their financial success. They never bothered to read the complex fine print. When I purchased this massive mountain plot 20 years ago, I did not just buy the 3 acres the cabin sits on. I was the chief structural engineer for Jackson Commercial Real Estate, an enterprise I quietly built from a single local construction crew into a massive corporate holding firm spanning 3 states. I specifically engineered the zoning lines and property tracks to ensure absolute impenetrable privacy for Corinne. The 5-mile paved road winding up the mountain leading from the county highway to the cabin gate was not part of the residential deed he possessed. I had purchased that entire stretch of land separately under a corporate trust belonging directly to my real estate group. The cabin itself was zoned as a residential asset, but the access road was strictly zoned as private corporate property. I maintained absolute legal authority and full liability over who could and could not transit that road. Logan had successfully forged a power of attorney for my personal residential assets, but he had absolutely zero legal jurisdiction over my corporate business holdings. He was essentially occupying a small island, and I completely controlled the only bridge connecting it to the mainland. Without my direct corporate authorization, not a single commercial vehicle, delivery truck, or unauthorized corporate guest could legally cross that fortified checkpoint. He thought he was the undisputed master of the sprawling estate, but he was completely trapped in a heavily fortified legal cage of my own meticulous design. Logan let out a loud, forced laugh, shaking his head in absolute disbelief at my explanation. "You are completely delusional," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You are making up fake corporate zoning laws because you are desperate to hold on to whatever little power you think you have left. I am going down there right now to manually pry open that gate and bring my food up here." He turned around abruptly and stormed out of the dusty shed, with Jada hurrying nervously to keep up with his angry strides. I sat back down in my chair and pulled out my encrypted burner phone. I sent a quick 1-line text message to the elite private security firm contracted by my corporation to monitor our commercial land holdings. The message simply read, "Enforce corporate perimeter trespassers are attempting to breach the mountain access road." I turned my attention back to the high-definition surveillance monitors, watching Logan's luxury SUV speed aggressively down the long, winding driveway toward the bottom of the hill. 15 minutes later, the live security feed from the lower gate checkpoint flashed onto my large secondary screen. Logan hopped out of his vehicle and marched toward the heavy steel gate, ready to manually force it open. Before he could even lay a single hand on the solid metal bars, 2 heavily armored black SUVs with flashing yellow lights blocked his path from the opposite side. 4 uniformed private security officers stepped out, resting their hands casually on their duty belts, projecting absolute authority. I turned up the audio feed and listened intently as the lead officer approached Logan with a stern, uncompromising expression. "Sir, you are attempting to authorize commercial traffic on a strictly private corporate road," the officer stated firmly. "Please present your corporate transit permit immediately, or we will be forced to turn these catering trucks around and cite you for criminal trespassing." Logan froze, staring at the armed men and the massive steel barrier. He reached into his pocket, pulling out nothing but empty air. He realized for the very first time that he was completely cornered. The grand, lavish feast was officially over, and the Mercer family was about to starve on their stolen mountain. The sun reached its highest point in the sky, and the luxurious Mercer family reunion was rapidly descending into utter chaos. I sat in the dim light of the storage shed, watching the live security feed from the main deck with quiet, calculated satisfaction. The 20 hungry and highly entitled guests were growing increasingly hostile. Without the premium catering trucks, there was absolutely zero food on the mountain, and the expensive alcohol they had been guzzling on an empty stomach was only fueling their aggression. Richard Mercer was pacing the expansive wooden deck, his face flushed a furious shade of red, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen about the profound incompetence of his hosts. Patricia Mercer, clutching an empty crystal wine glass, turned her venomous attention directly toward Jada. I cranked up the audio feed to hear every word. She looked my daughter up and down with absolute, undisguised disdain. "Your father is a completely useless old man," Patricia sneered, not caring who heard her shrill voice. "We graciously allow him to stay on this property, and he repays us by ruining our entire weekend. He is a massive embarrassment to this family, Jada. You need to go down to that dirty shed right now and demand he fix this immediately, or he can pack his bags and walk down the mountain today." Jada, utterly desperate to please these awful fake rich people, nodded frantically. She turned on her heels and practically sprinted down the dirt path toward my location. The heavy wooden door flew open and Jada burst into the dusty shed. Her face was streaked with tears of deep humiliation, and her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. "Dad, you have to stop this childish game right now," she pleaded, her voice a pathetic mix of whining and demanding. "Logan just called from the bottom of the hill. The armed security guards will not let the food trucks pass the lower checkpoint. You have to call whoever you know and fix this gate issue immediately. You are completely ruining everything for us." I remained perfectly still, sitting in front of my darkened computer screens. I did not offer her a chair, a tissue, or a shred of fatherly comfort. "You want me to fix the gate so your husband can feed the people who just called me a useless old man?" I asked, my voice as cold and hard as winter ice. Jada stamped her expensive leather boot on the concrete floor like a spoiled, petulant child. "You owe them a massive apology," she demanded, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You are making me look terrible in front of my new family. They are important, powerful people, Dad. You need to march up there, apologize to Richard and Patricia for this massive inconvenience, and then get on your phone and unlock that private road." I looked at the grown woman standing in front of me. The sheer blinding audacity of her demands was staggering to witness. I decided it was time to test the absolute limits of her moral corruption. I stood up slowly and walked toward her until we were merely inches apart. "Let me ask you a very simple, direct question, Jada," I said, maintaining intense, unbreakable eye contact. "Did you know that Logan used my forged signature to use this entire cabin as collateral for a $2 million commercial loan?" Jada froze completely. The angry flush drained entirely from her face, leaving her pale and visibly shaking. She looked away, her eyes darting toward the heavy wooden door as if desperately searching for an escape route. "You knew," I stated, the realization hitting me with absolute, undeniable certainty. She swallowed hard, and then, instead of apologizing or showing any genuine remorse, she defensively crossed her arms over her chest. "Logan is going through a temporary liquidity crisis right now," she argued, her voice rising in a frantic, high-pitched defense. "The commercial market shifted unexpectedly. We just need to leverage the massive equity in this property to save his investment fund from going under. You have plenty of money, Dad. You have investments. For our future, what is wrong with you, sacrificing a little bit to help your own daughter succeed? He is going to pay it all back once the market stabilizes. You are just being incredibly selfish and stubborn." I stared at her, feeling a profound, irreversible internal shift taking place inside my chest. For 32 years, I had poured every single ounce of my soul, my sweat, and my financial resources into protecting and providing for this girl. When her mother, Corinne, passed away, I made a silent, sacred vow at her graveside to ensure Jada never wanted for anything in this harsh world. I paid cash for her elite private schools, funded her lavish European summer backpacking trips, and paid for the wildly extravagant wedding to a man I instantly knew was a shallow, incompetent fraud. I did it all because I naively believed that providing unconditional love and endless financial support would eventually build her character. I thought my relentless backing would give her a rock-solid foundation of security. But looking at her right now, desperately defending a man who was actively committing massive federal fraud against her own father, I realized my unconditional love had tragically mutated into a toxic enabler. She was not a helpless victim of Logan's emotional manipulation. She was a fully willing, calculating participant. She had eagerly absorbed the Mercer family's fake entitled values and consciously decided that my lifelong hard work was simply a convenient resource to be plundered for her social status. The sweet daughter Corinne and I had raised was completely dead and gone, entirely replaced by a greedy, unrecognizable stranger who viewed my ultimate sacrifice as her basic, expected inheritance. In that exact moment, the final lingering thread of my paternal affection snapped entirely. The warm, fatherly instinct was extinguished, leaving behind absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical, and ruthlessly calculating detachment. I was no longer a father dealing with a misguided, confused child. I was a seasoned corporate survivor dealing with a hostile, dangerous parasite who had actively breached my secure perimeter. I took a slow step back and gave her a chillingly blank, emotionless stare. "You have completely chosen your new family, Jada," I said, my voice dangerously soft, but carrying the absolute weight of a final judgment. "So you can go back up there and starve with them." I turned my back to her and walked directly toward my hidden server bank behind the false wooden wall. Jada shrieked in extreme frustration, kicking a plastic bucket across the concrete floor before turning around and storming out of the shed, slamming the heavy wooden door violently behind her. As soon as the metal latch clicked shut, I pulled away the wooden panel and brought my high-definition monitors to life. I opened the highly secure digital folder containing all the intercepted and categorized documents. The forged power of attorney, the fake Alzheimer's medical diagnosis illegally signed by Dr. Thorne, the fraudulent bill of sale for Corinne's classic Mustang, and the extensive, highly detailed internal ledgers proving Logan's massive corporate insolvency. I opened a highly secure encrypted email portal routed through a specialized offshore virtual private network. I attached every single damning file into one massive, undeniable digital dossier. I addressed the encrypted email directly to the lead investigating agent at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, white-collar crime division in our specific district, a ruthless man I had personally collaborated with years ago during a massive municipal corruption case. In the subject line, I typed, "Comprehensive evidence of ongoing interstate wire fraud, medical forgery, and identity theft by Logan Mercer." I did not hesitate for a single fleeting second. I reached out and clicked the send button. The progress bar flashed a bright, solid green, confirming the successful transmission of the deadly digital payload. The federal trap was officially and permanently sprung, and the rapid countdown to their absolute destruction had just begun. The afternoon dragged on, and the atmosphere on the mountain turned incredibly hostile. The Mercer family was starving, furious, and completely out of alcohol. Logan had to pivot his strategy to save his collapsing financial empire. He could not feed his entitled family, but he desperately needed to secure his $2 million commercial loan before Monday morning to avoid federal bankruptcy. Through my surveillance monitors, I watched him orchestrate his final, most desperate move. He had managed to bypass the blocked catering trucks by inviting the one man who could single-handedly authorize his fraudulent loan application. A black, heavily armored luxury SUV pulled into the crushed gravel driveway, bypassing the lower gate using a high-level corporate access code. The man stepping out of the massive vehicle was Arthur Sterling, the highly influential chairman of the Sterling Vanguard Investment Fund. Logan practically sprinted out of the front door to greet him, smoothing his wrinkled designer suit and plastering on a fake, confident smile. He was banking everything on this single meeting, hoping to use my massive cabin as the ultimate illusion of wealth to impress the prominent billionaire and finalize the theft. I watched Arthur Sterling walk into the expansive living room, his sharp eyes evaluating the custom stonework and the massive oak beams. Logan stood beside him, puffing out his chest with unearned pride. "Welcome to my private mountain retreat," Arthur Logan boasted, spreading his arms wide as if he had laid the foundation himself. "I recently acquired this entire estate through a family trust. It is fully paid off, highly exclusive, and serves as the perfect collateral for the rapid expansion of our joint venture." Logan was laying the groundwork for his massive federal fraud right in my living room, completely unaware that his every word was being documented. I decided it was the perfect moment to make my physical appearance and assist him in digging his legal grave. I walked to the corner of the shed and pulled out an old grease-stained pair of heavy canvas coveralls and a pair of worn-out leather gardening gloves. I smeared a handful of dark soil across my cheek and jawline to complete the look of a lowly, overworked groundskeeper. I marched out of the shed, walked around the side of the cabin, and entered through the kitchen. I prepared a simple silver tray with 3 cups of hot tea. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors leading into the main living room, walking slowly and keeping my head slightly bowed. Jada and Patricia Mercer were sitting on the expensive leather sofas. Patricia instantly wrinkled her nose in absolute disgust at my dirty appearance, holding her hand over her face. Logan stopped his grand presentation mid-sentence as soon as he saw me enter the room. His face contorted with complete rage. He immediately stepped away from Sterling and marched toward me, lowering his voice into a vicious, threatening hiss. "What the hell do you think you are doing in here, old man?" Logan demanded, grabbing my arm roughly and trying to pull me toward the hallway. "I told you to stay in the shed and keep out of sight. You are tracking dirt all over my clean floors and ruining my incredibly important meeting." He turned back to Sterling and offered a nervous, highly apologetic laugh. "I am so sorry about this, Arthur. This is just the hired help. He is an old groundskeeper who came with the property when I inherited it. He is a little senile and forgets his proper place sometimes. I will have him removed immediately so we can discuss the financial terms of the loan in complete peace." He tightened his grip on my arm, attempting to forcefully shove me out of the room like a stray dog. I stood my ground, my posture solid as an iron beam. I gently pulled my arm out of his aggressive grasp and looked directly past Logan to the prominent billionaire standing near the stone fireplace. What Logan completely failed to comprehend was the actual hidden hierarchy of the commercial real estate world. Arthur Sterling was an incredibly powerful man in the public eye, running a multi-billion-dollar investment fund that graced the covers of national financial magazines. He attended high society galas and commanded absolute respect in the banking sector. But true wealth and absolute power operate entirely in the shadows. Sterling did not build his massive fund alone. 10 years ago, his firm was on the brink of complete liquidation due to aggressive over-leveraging and poor market predictions. I was the silent, unidentified partner who injected $80 million of untraceable corporate capital into his failing enterprise, restructuring his debt and saving him from total bankruptcy. Jackson Commercial Real Estate. My primary holding company owned the absolute majority share of the Sterling Vanguard Investment Fund. Arthur Sterling was not an untouchable billionaire acting on his own authority. He was my direct subordinate. He answered exclusively to me in every major commercial transaction, and he managed my vast portfolio under strict non-disclosure agreements to protect my total privacy. We had acquired downtown skyscrapers and massive shipping ports together without my name ever appearing on a single public document. Logan was actively trying to secure a $2 million loan from a fund that I personally owned using my own stolen house as the fraudulent collateral. He was literally begging my own employee for my own money. The absolute irony of the situation was almost too perfect to believe. Logan thought he was a financial genius playing in the major leagues, but he was merely an ignorant thief trying to steal a crumb from the picnic of a giant. I stepped fully into the bright light pouring through the massive living room windows, completely ignoring Logan's frantic attempts to block me. I held the silver tray perfectly steady and looked Arthur Sterling dead in the eye without uttering a single word. Sterling turned away from the architectural details of the fireplace and finally focused his attention on the old, dirty groundskeeper standing in the middle of the room. The polite, business-oriented smile vanished from his face in a fraction of a second. All the blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him as pale as a ghost. He took a sudden, staggering step backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly against the hardwood floor. His hands began to tremble so violently that he dropped his heavy leather portfolio, sending highly confidential financial documents scattering across the custom rug. Patricia Mercer gasped out loud at the sudden mess, but Sterling ignored the dropped papers entirely. His wide, terrified eyes locked firmly on my face, recognizing the features hidden beneath the smeared dirt and the greasy canvas coveralls. Boss Sterling whispered, his voice cracking with absolute shock and profound confusion. "Mr. Jackson, what on earth is going on here? Why are you dressed like a groundskeeper in your own home?" The sheer panic in the billionaire's voice echoed loudly through the silent cabin, freezing the air in the room. Jada dropped her wine glass, shattering it against the floor. Logan froze entirely, his arms still outstretched toward the hallway. He turned his head back and forth between my calm, dirty face and the terrified investment titan standing across the room. The magnificent illusion of his wealth and power instantly evaporated, leaving him completely exposed and utterly defenseless. The absolute silence that followed Arthur Sterling's panicked words was heavier than solid concrete. The mountain wind howling outside the large glass windows was the only sound left in the entire world. Patricia Mercer sat frozen on the expensive leather sofa, her mouth slightly open, her hand still clutching her throat in profound shock. The arrogant sneer she had worn since she arrived on my property had completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Jada stared at the shattered remains of her crystal wine glass on the hardwood floor, completely paralyzed by the sudden catastrophic collapse of her fabricated reality. She could not comprehend how the father she had just dismissed as a useless burden was suddenly commanding the absolute respect of a billionaire titan. But it was Logan's face that told the entire tragic story. The confident, untouchable mask he had worn for years melted away in a single devastating instant. All the blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw trembled violently, and his eyes darted back and forth between my calm face and the billionaire he had been so desperately trying to impress. He was trying to process the impossible mathematics of the situation before him. The helpless, senile old man he had locked in a freezing storage shed was being addressed as boss by the most powerful financial figure in the state. The entire foundation of his fake wealthy life was crumbling beneath his expensive leather shoes, and he was absolutely powerless to stop it. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a pathetic, wheezing sound. I slowly lowered the silver tray onto the coffee table, the gentle clink of the porcelain cups sounding like a judge banging his final gavel. I reached up and methodically peeled off my dirty canvas gardening gloves, tossing them casually onto the pristine glass surface, right next to Logan's expensive leather portfolio. I wiped the dark soil from my cheek with a clean handkerchief from my pocket, standing tall and straight, letting my true posture return. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to command the room. True power never has to yell. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my heavy coveralls and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I tossed it onto the glass table directly in front of Arthur Sterling. The heavy thud of the paper made Logan flinch violently, as if he had just been struck. "Go ahead and open it, Arthur," I instructed, maintaining a cold and authoritative tone. "Tell this young man exactly whose money he is trying to borrow today." Arthur Sterling, his hands still visibly shaking, reached out and opened the envelope. He pulled out the thick stack of documents I had meticulously compiled from my hidden server. The first page was the forged power of attorney, clearly displaying my copied signature. The second was the fraudulent $2 million commercial loan application Logan had eagerly submitted to the Sterling Vanguard Investment Fund just hours ago. The third and most damning was the fake medical diagnosis signed by the corrupt Dr. Eris Thorne, falsely claiming I had advanced stage Alzheimer's disease. Arthur scanned the documents, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he recognized the blatant criminal fraud sitting right in front of his face. He looked at Logan with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You submitted a commercial loan application using stolen collateral," Arthur said, his voice rising in professional anger. "You used forged medical documents to bypass the primary stakeholder's authorization and strip away civil rights. This is not just a bad investment strategy. Logan, this is massive federal wire fraud. You are actively trying to steal $2 million from this fund." I took a slow, deliberate step toward my son-in-law, watching him shrink back. "Did you really think you could use my own property to scam my own investment firm?" I asked, my voice echoing off the high wooden beams. "Did you honestly believe you were smart enough to pull off a multi-million-dollar heist against the man who built the very financial infrastructure you are standing on? You are nothing but a pathetic small-time thief wearing a suit you bought on massive credit." Logan was completely and utterly ignorant of the intricate financial webbing that held his fragile world together. When he submitted that desperate loan application to the Sterling Vanguard Investment Fund, he thought he was tapping into a faceless corporate reserve run by distant banking executives. He had absolutely no idea how the massive flow of capital actually worked at that elite level of commercial real estate. The Sterling Fund was primarily a front-facing vehicle used to deploy and multiply the massive cash reserves generated by Jackson Commercial Real Estate. The $2 million Logan was begging for was not generic bank money. It was not a collective investor pool. It was my own personal liquid money. It was the capital I had personally accumulated from decades of developing downtown commercial districts and selling lucrative corporate portfolios to international buyers. If his fraudulent loan had been magically approved, The money wired into his failing company would have been directly extracted from my own private corporate trust. He was literally trying to rob my personal vault to pay off his bad gambling debts and failed retail investments, while simultaneously stealing the very house I lived in to serve as the collateral for the theft. The sheer mathematical irony of his crime was almost beautiful in its total, absolute stupidity. He had spent years looking down on me because of my race, my age, and my quiet, unassuming demeanor, completely failing to realize that I was the silent apex predator in the financial ecosystem he was so desperately trying to survive in. He thought he was hunting a weak, wounded animal, but he had willingly walked directly into the jaws of a lion. He believed his degree and his country club membership made him a genius, but he was just a careless, arrogant boy playing a highly dangerous game of adult chess without knowing how any of the pieces actually moved. The crushing reality of his absolute failure finally snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity Logan had left in his brain. He looked down at the damning documents spread across the glass table detailing his federal crimes. He looked at the billionaire who was now staring at him with complete professional contempt, ready to destroy his career. And then he looked at me, the man he had mocked, humiliated, and tried to lock away in a psychiatric ward just to steal a weekend getaway. The realization that he was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, elder abuse, and identity theft hit him all at once like a physical blow. His breathing became incredibly ragged and shallow, his chest heaving wildly under his tight designer shirt. A primal, desperate panic washed over his face, completely replacing his arrogant charm. The charming son-in-law was dead, and a cornered rat took his place. He let out a raw, guttural scream that sounded like a wounded wild animal trapped in a snare. "Shut up!" he roared, his face twisting into a mask of pure, violent rage. "It is a lie. You are completely setting me up. This is all a fake setup by a crazy old man." Without a single second of warning, Logan completely lost his mind. He lunged across the coffee table, kicking the silver tray and scattering the hot tea everywhere. He knocked the heavy glass surface completely off its wooden base, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. He launched his entire body weight directly at me, his hands outstretched like desperate claws aiming straight for my throat. He was entirely focused on silencing me, on grabbing those documents and tearing them to shreds before anyone else could see them. He was perfectly willing to commit severe physical violence right in front of a major financial witness just to destroy the evidence of his massive failure. The physical attack was sudden, aggressive, and completely unhinged. The illusion of the sophisticated businessman was completely dead, and all that remained was a violent, terrified criminal fighting desperately for his own pathetic life. Logan lunged across the shattered remnants of the coffee table, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged violence. I did not flinch. I did not step back. Before his manicured, desperate fingers could even brush the collar of my heavy canvas coveralls, a massive blur of motion intercepted him mid-air. Arthur Sterling did not travel to remote mountain locations to conduct multi-million-dollar deals without top-tier executive protection. His personal bodyguard, a towering man built like a solid brick wall, stepped out from the shadows of the hallway with terrifying, calculated speed. He caught Logan by the shoulder and throat, using the younger man's own chaotic momentum against him. With a single brutal twist, the bodyguard slammed Logan face first into the hardwood floor. The impact was sickeningly loud, a heavy thud that knocked the wind entirely out of his lungs. Logan groaned, pinned helplessly under the bodyguard's heavy knee, his expensive suit tearing at the shoulder seam. Patricia Mercer finally found her voice. She unleashed a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed off the vaulted wooden ceilings, clutching her expensive pearls in absolute horror. "Get your hands off my son!" she screamed, her face contorting into a mask of indignant rage. "You are assaulting him. He is the owner of this property. He does not own a single splinter of this property," a new sharply authoritative voice announced from the front entrance. The heavy oak doors swung wide open, revealing my personal attorney, Marcus Sullivan. He was a ruthless legal predator who wore custom three-piece suits like medieval armor. He strode into the chaotic living room with absolute unwavering confidence, carrying a thick leather briefcase that held the legal execution of the entire Mercer family. 2 armed private security contractors followed closely behind him, taking up strategic positions by the exits, their hands resting on their duty belts. Patricia took a sudden step back, her aggressive shrieks dying in her throat as she realized the drastic shift in the power dynamic. "Who the hell are you?" Richard Mercer demanded, trying to puff out his chest and project the authority of a wealthy patriarch. Though his voice wavered with uncertainty, Sullivan did not even grant Richard the dignity of a glance. He walked straight to the center of the room, stepping carefully over the shattered glass of the coffee table, and looked down at Logan, who was still pinned to the floor, gasping for air like a landed fish. "I am Marcus Sullivan, Chief Legal Counsel for Mr. Miles Jackson and the Jackson Commercial Real Estate Enterprise," he stated, his voice carrying the lethal precision of a sniper rifle. "And as of 9 o'clock this morning, the fraudulent power of attorney document you forced my client to sign under heavy medical sedation has been legally and permanently revoked by a federal judge." Sullivan popped open his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of court-stamped documents, dropping them next to Logan's face. "Furthermore, Mr. Mercer, based on the overwhelming digital evidence of interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted financial extortion submitted to the federal authorities earlier today, an emergency injunction has been executed. As we speak, every single bank account, investment portfolio, and line of credit bearing your name, your wife's name, or the name of your failing firm has been entirely frozen." Logan's eyes widened in absolute suffocating terror. The remaining air left the room. "You cannot do that," Logan wheezed, struggling uselessly against the bodyguard's immense weight. "My business, my accounts, you are ruining me." Sullivan offered a cold, predatory smile. "You ruined yourself, Logan. The bank is currently reversing the transactions you attempted to make using Mr. Jackson's stolen collateral. You possess zero liquidity. You cannot access a single dime to pay your private creditors, your caterers, or the elite defense attorneys you are going to desperately need by the end of this afternoon." While Logan and Jada genuinely thought they were punishing me by locking a 69-year-old man in an unheated, dusty storage shed, they were actually handing me the ultimate uninterrupted sanctuary to engineer their complete financial demise. Over the past 48 hours, while they drank my vintage wine and partied on my deck, I had been in constant encrypted communication with Sullivan. I transmitted the forged signatures, the false medical reports, and the illegal loan applications directly to his secure legal servers in the city. Sullivan did not just file standard motions, he utilized his extensive, highly cultivated network of federal judges and aggressive banking regulators to secure emergency asset freezes. This is a complex legal process that usually takes weeks to navigate, but we executed it in a matter of hours due to the sheer magnitude and undeniable clarity of the documented fraud. We built an inescapable legal cage reinforcing every single bar with irrefutable digital evidence salvaged straight from Logan's unprotected hard drive. My decades in commercial real estate taught me that you never strike your opponent until you have completely severed their supply lines and cut off their avenues of retreat. I did not just want Logan to fail his loan application, I wanted to ensure he could not even buy a cup of cheap coffee to wash down the bitter taste of his utter defeat. I had effectively starved out his fraudulent enterprise while sitting on a flattened cardboard bed operating a salvaged server in the freezing cold. He severely underestimated my patience and, more importantly, he fundamentally misunderstood my capacity for ruthless, methodical retaliation. I was a man who built skyscrapers. I knew exactly how to demolish a weak foundation with explosive precision. Jada, who had remained frozen in a state of catatonic shock near the ruined sofa, finally collapsed. Her knees hit the hardwood floor amidst the scattered shards of broken glass, but she did not seem to notice the sharp cuts forming on her skin. The crushing reality of their absolute ruin had finally penetrated her thick skull. She looked at her husband, pinned like a common criminal, and then looked up at me. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto her designer clothes. "Dad, please," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine that echoed in the silent room. "Please stop this. We will leave. We will give the house back. Just tell your lawyer to unfreeze our accounts. I will lose everything. My house, my car, my entire life. Please, I am your daughter. I am your little girl." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no warmth, no pity, and no lingering fatherly instinct. The girl I had raised died the exact moment she handed me those forged documents in a hospital bed. "You stopped being my daughter the moment you decided my life was an acceptable sacrifice for your social status," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, as cold as the mountain wind. I turned my gaze to my lawyer, Sullivan. I commanded the sheer silence in the room, amplifying my words. "Take out the newly updated last will and testament we finalized this morning. Read the beneficiary clause to her." Sullivan pulled a crisp white document from his briefcase, clearing his throat loudly. Jada looked up, her eyes filled with a new, distinct kind of horror. Pursuant to the legal directives of Mr. Miles Jackson, Sullivan read his voice echoing clearly across the room. Jada Mercer is hereby permanently disinherited and formally stripped of all claims to any assets, trusts, or capital. The entirety of the estate will be transferred immediately to the Jackson Foundation for Orphaned Youth. Jada let out a gut-wrenching wail. The financial execution was officially complete. The sheer finality of my words hung in the air, but Patricia Mercer refused to accept her absolute defeat. She was a woman who had spent her entire life weaponizing her social status and her race to bend the world to her will, expecting everyone else to simply bow their heads and submit. She looked at Logan pinned to the hardwood floor by Arthur Sterling's massive bodyguard, and then glared at me with absolute venomous hatred. She reached into her expensive designer purse and pulled out her gold-plated smartphone. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, but her profound entitlement was perfectly intact. She punched 3 numbers into the glowing screen with aggressive force and raised the phone to her ear. She demanded emergency police assistance, immediately screaming into the receiver with a voice dripping with calculated hysteria. She told the dispatcher she was at a luxury mountain estate and that her family was being held hostage by a violent and deranged black man. She completely fabricated a story claiming I had hired armed thugs to assault her successful son and was currently attempting to extort millions of dollars from their innocent family. She demanded they send multiple units right now before I killed them all. She hung up the phone and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. She hissed triumphantly that I was going to spend the rest of my miserable life in a tiny concrete cell. She proudly declared that the police were coming to drag me away like a violent animal, and that my pathetic attempt to ruin them had just backfired permanently. I did not move a single muscle to stop her from making that frantic emergency call. I simply stood there with my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my heavy canvas coveralls, watching her fully commit to her own magnificent delusion. Sullivan let out a dry, humorless chuckle and checked his expensive silver watch, while the private security contractors remained perfectly still by the main exits, completely unbothered by her dramatic threats. Jada was still crying on the floor, but she looked up with a sudden spark of pathetic hope, genuinely thinking her powerful mother-in-law had just saved the day. The tense, suffocating silence in the room was eventually shattered by the distant but unmistakable wail of heavy sirens echoing up the winding mountain road. The sounds multiplied, growing louder and significantly more aggressive as a convoy of heavy vehicles sped up the private corporate driveway I had specifically left open for their arrival. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of my living room, creating a chaotic disco of impending justice. Heavy boots slammed onto the wooden porch, and the front doors were pushed open entirely. 4 imposing men strode into the room, but they were not wearing the standard blue uniforms of the local county sheriff's department. They wore dark tactical gear with heavy ballistic vests and large yellow letters stenciled aggressively across their chests. Patricia stepped forward, instantly pointing her finger directly at my chest again with an arrogant, triumphant smirk. She demanded they arrest me right now using her shrill, commanding voice. She insisted I organized a violent assault against her innocent son and was attempting a massive financial extortion. She ordered them to throw me in handcuffs and get me out of her house immediately. Patricia Mercer completely failed to realize that her frantic emergency call to the local county dispatcher was entirely redundant. The heavily armed men storming into my living room were not local police responding to a distressed, wealthy white woman. They were elite federal agents from the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When I sat in the freezing storage shed and hit send on that highly encrypted email, I did not just send a generic anonymous tip to a public police hotline. I transmitted a comprehensive, flawless digital dossier directly to Special Agent Vance, a ruthless and highly efficient federal investigator I had personally collaborated with nearly 2 decades ago. During a massive commercial development project, I had quietly provided Vance with the internal financial blueprints needed to take down a massive union extortion ring that was bleeding the city dry. He owed me a massive professional favor, and I had just handed him the absolute career-defining bust of a lifetime on a literal silver platter. The digital package I sent contained Logan's forged power of attorney, the fraudulent medical diagnostics signed by a corrupt doctor, and the massive trail of illegal wire transfers crossing state lines. The moment Vance opened that file, he immediately secured a federal arrest warrant from a federal judge, bypassing the local jurisdiction entirely. He had mobilized his tactical unit hours before Patricia even thought about picking up her gold-plated smartphone to play the victim. Her frantic call simply provided the perfect comedic timing for a federal raid that was already executing with absolute military precision. She thought her privilege was an impenetrable shield, but she was standing directly in the path of a federal freight train I had personally set into motion. The lead federal agent completely ignored Patricia's aggressive pointing and her shrill, hysterical demands. He did not even cast a single glance in my direction. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps right past her, brushing her expensive silk shoulder aside as if she were nothing more than an annoying piece of broken furniture blocking his path. Patricia gasped in profound outrage, dropping her arm and staring in absolute shock as the tactical agent marched directly toward the center of the shattered coffee table. The massive bodyguard stepped back, releasing his brutal physical grip on Logan. Logan gasped for air, pushing himself up onto his knees, his expensive designer suit completely ruined and his face covered in dark dust and sharp glass shards. He looked up at the towering federal agent, expecting to be rescued from his humiliating predicament and handed back his stolen authority. Instead, the agent reached to the back of his tactical belt and pulled out a heavy pair of solid steel handcuffs. The loud metallic clink echoed sharply across the quiet room, cutting through the tension. The agent announced Logan's full name using a booming baritone voice that left absolutely zero room for negotiation or argument. He explicitly stated that Logan was under federal arrest for massive interstate wire fraud, severe identity theft, and multiple counts of criminal forgery. He informed him he had the right to remain completely silent and highly suggested he use it immediately. The agent violently grabbed Logan's arms, twisting them forcefully behind his back and snapping the cold steel cuffs securely around his wrists. Patricia let out a blood-curdling scream, finally realizing the authorities had not come to save her family, but to drag her precious son away to a federal penitentiary. The final curtain had officially fallen on their grand illusion. The elite federal agents hauled Logan off the shattered glass of the living room floor and dragged him roughly toward the front door. His expensive custom-tailored suit hung off his shoulders like a dirty, discarded rag completely ruined by the struggle. He stumbled blindly and dragged his feet entirely drained of his usual arrogant swagger and false bravado. The Grand Mercer family reunion had instantly transformed into a chaotic and active federal crime scene right before their eyes. The 20 entitled guests who had been demanding premium catering and vintage wine just an hour ago were now scrambling in pure, absolute panic. They grabbed their expensive coats and fled the cabin like desperate rats fleeing a sinking ship, terrified of being associated with a major federal fraud investigation. Patricia followed the tactical agents out to the wooden porch, wailing loudly and clawing at her perfectly styled hair. She begged the federal agents to let her precious boy go, completely ignoring the massive reality that he had actively tried to steal millions of dollars. The blinding red and blue lights of the tactical vehicles illuminated the dark mountain, casting long, erratic shadows across the crushed gravel. Logan was shoved unceremoniously into the back of a heavily armored federal transport vehicle. The heavy solid steel door slammed shut, echoing through the trees with the undeniable sound of absolute finality. Richard Mercer watched his only son get locked inside the dark federal vehicle, his face turning a blotchy, furious shade of purple. He finally snapped out of his cowardly, shocked silence and marched aggressively toward the lead federal agent. He pulled a thick leather-bound checkbook from his breast pocket, trying desperately to project the fake authority of a wealthy, untouchable patriarch. He attempted to buy his way out of a catastrophic legal situation, assuming his fake money could solve any problem. He demanded to know the exact bail amount, insisting he would write a massive corporate check right there on the hood of the tactical vehicle to secure Logan's immediate release. He yelled frantically that his family had highly powerful lawyers on retainer and that this entire violent raid was a massive misunderstanding that would be easily resolved by morning. Sullivan, my ruthless personal attorney, stepped out onto the porch and let out a loud, mocking laugh that cut sharply through the crisp mountain air. He walked slowly down the wooden steps, adjusting his tailored vest, and stood directly in front of the sweating, angry man. Sullivan informed him with a razor-sharp, predatory smile that federal wire fraud and severe identity theft do not come with a convenient roadside bail option. He told Richard to put his completely useless checkbook away because the fancy paper it was printed on was currently worth significantly more than his entire corporate enterprise. Sullivan explicitly revealed that the emergency federal injunction I had meticulously triggered earlier that morning did not just target Logan's personal bank accounts. Because Richard had foolishly co-signed several initial business loans for Logan's failing investment fund, his own corporate holding accounts were now deeply and permanently entangled in the massive federal fraud investigation. Sullivan proudly announced that the Federal Banking Commission had already completely frozen every single asset, investment, and credit line bearing the Mercer family name. Richard stared at the lawyer, his hand trembling so violently he dropped his expensive gold pen onto the dirt. He stammered uncontrollably, insisting that his logistics company was completely separate and legally untouchable. Sullivan took a step closer and informed him that the federal banks had already initiated aggressive clawback procedures to recover the stolen capital. Richard had absolutely zero liquidity left to his name anywhere in the world. He could not bail out his criminal son, he could not hire a high-powered federal defense attorney, and he could not even afford to buy a cheap motel room for his family to sleep in tonight. The immense financial fortress the Mercers had used to blindly bully and intimidate the world for decades was completely and utterly leveled to the dirt. When I sat in that freezing, dusty storage shed organizing the digital files salvaged from Logan's entirely unprotected hard drive, I did not just focus on his immediate sloppy attempt to steal my mountain cabin. I spent my entire career building massive commercial real estate empires and managing billion-dollar budgets, so I knew exactly how to trace the hidden toxic roots of corporate debt. I quickly discovered that Richard's supposedly highly successful logistics company was nothing more than a fragile hollow shell completely propped up by toxic, fraudulent loans generated by Logan's failing investment fund. They were constantly moving fake money back and forth between their personal and corporate accounts to create the absolute illusion of massive generational wealth. They honestly thought they were brilliant financial geniuses running a sophisticated high-level shell game that no one would ever notice. I knew that simply stopping Logan from stealing my property would only be a temporary minor victory. They would eventually regroup, find another vulnerable target to aggressively exploit, and continue their parasitic lifestyle. I decided to initiate a total, completely scorched earth legal protocol to ensure they never harmed anyone else ever again. By meticulously mapping out their deeply interconnected banking structure and handing that precise digital roadmap directly to the highest federal authorities, I ensured that the resulting asset freeze would spread like a highly aggressive fatal virus through their entire financial ecosystem. I did not just cut off a single annoying branch of their toxic family tree, I poisoned the deep roots and heavily salted the earth so absolutely nothing would ever grow there again. They looked at my skin color, my age, and my quiet, unassuming demeanor and naturally assumed I was too ignorant to understand their sophisticated white-collar crimes. They completely failed to realize that I was the exact seasoned corporate architect who originally designed the very banking security protocols they were so foolishly and arrogantly trying to bypass. Richard fell heavily to his knees in the crushed gravel, completely broken by the sudden violent vaporization of his entire fake empire. Patricia stopped her shrill wailing and stared at her defeated husband in absolute horrifying disbelief, finally realizing she was now completely penniless and utterly homeless. The sheer magnitude of their sudden destruction was absolute, but my highly calculated vengeance was not quite finished yet. Before the heavy federal transport vehicle carrying Logan could even begin to pull out of the long, winding driveway, a loud, familiar engine roar echoed aggressively up the dark mountain road. The heavy rubber tires of a massive flatbed tow truck crunched loudly over the gravel, making its way directly toward the bright cabin. Sitting perfectly secured on the back of the heavy truck was Corinna's pristine cherry-red '68 Ford Mustang gleaming beautifully under the tactical lights. A local county sheriff cruiser followed closely behind the tow truck with its red and blue lights flashing brightly in the night. The greasy buyer who had tried to steal my late wife's precious car was sitting locked in the back of the police cruiser in heavy steel handcuffs. The lead federal agent walked over to the local sheriff, who quickly explained that the sleazy buyer had immediately confessed to purchasing a stolen vehicle across state lines using completely forged ownership documents provided directly by Logan Mercer. The federal agent nodded with a grim, highly satisfied smile and pulled a secondary folded warrant from his tactical vest. He walked over to the armored transport vehicle, slid open the small metal viewing window, and looked directly into Logan's terrified, bruised face. The agent loudly informed Logan that grand theft auto and the interstate trafficking of highly valuable stolen goods had just been officially added to his massive list of active federal felony charges. Logan buried his face deep in his chained hands, sobbing uncontrollably in the dark as the true, inescapable weight of his incoming decade-long prison sentence finally crushed his arrogant soul. The flashing red and blue tactical lights finally faded completely down the dark, winding mountain road, leaving the massive custom-built cabin in a heavy, suffocating silence. Jada stood completely alone in the center of the shattered living room, surrounded entirely by the sharp broken glass of the ruined coffee table. The massive crowd of arrogant party guests had vanished completely, leaving only the bitter remnants of their destroyed celebration scattered across the floor. Patricia and Richard Mercer, having just watched their only son hauled away in a heavily armored federal transport vehicle and their entire financial empire violently vaporized, turned their venomous attention directly toward the only remaining target. The cold mountain wind blew through the open front doors, chilling the room significantly. Patricia paced back and forth, her high heels clicking aggressively against the wood, looking like a cornered animal desperate to bite anyone who came near her. She marched aggressively up to Jada, her face contorted into a hideous mask of pure, vicious hatred. She pointed a violently shaking finger right at my daughter's pale face and began to scream with absolute unhinged fury. She blamed Jada for absolutely everything, calling her a useless, pathetic curse who had dragged their perfect, wealthy family into the dirty mud. Richard joined the brutal verbal assault, spitting terrible insults and loudly declaring that bringing her into their elite family was the absolute biggest mistake his son had ever made. They completely abandoned their sweet daughter-in-law the very second their fake wealth disappeared, showing their true ruthless colors. Jada stood there trembling violently while absorbing the vicious verbal abuse from the exact people she had so desperately tried to impress her entire adult life. She finally realized that the elite high society family she had completely sold her soul to join viewed her as absolutely nothing more than a convenient, disposable scapegoat. When Patricia raised her hand aggressively, as if she might physically strike her across the face, Jada finally broke down completely. She spun around frantically and dropped heavily to her knees on the hardwood floor, completely ignoring the sharp pieces of shattered glass digging deeply into her expensive designer jeans. She began to crawl frantically across the ruined living room floor toward where I was standing near the heavy wooden doors. She reached out with wildly trembling hands and wrapped her arms tightly around my heavy work boots, burying her tear-stained face directly against the tough canvas fabric of my coveralls. But the man who would have done that died the exact second he saw his meticulously forged signature on those stolen legal documents in the hospital. I did not reach down to comfort her trembling shoulders. I did not offer her a single solitary word of fatherly reassurance. I kept my hands firmly buried deep in my pockets and maintained an absolute rigid statue-like stillness. I looked over at Sullivan, who stood silently observing the pathetic scene with cold, clinical, professional detachment. I slowly and deliberately pulled my heavy work boot out from her desperate, grasping hands, taking a firm, solid step backward. "You made your choice, Jada," I stated, my voice echoing coldly and clearly through the empty, vaulted room. "You eagerly abandoned the father who built your entire life from scratch just so you could desperately please these horrible fake people." I told her that she traded her soul for a cheap illusion, and now she had to pay the massive outstanding bill. She gasped for air, choking on her own tears, completely unable to form a coherent sentence in response to my cold rejection. "Now you are begging for my ultimate protection only because your new family is completely broken and facing decades in federal prison. You do not get to come running back to the absolute safety of my foundation after you actively handed them the matches to burn it all to the ground." I stared down at her weeping, pathetic form, and my mind immediately flashed back to the freezing dark storage shed from earlier that very same morning. I clearly remembered the exact look of profound annoyance and utter disgust on her face when she walked through the heavy wooden door holding that flimsy paper plate covered tightly in cheap aluminum foil. She had handed me the cold, stiff leftover pancakes from her lavish catered breakfast and demanded that I stay completely hidden like a dirty secret so I would not embarrass her in front of her terrible new family. I remembered the countless hours I worked overtime just to buy her a custom dress for her high school prom. I remembered the immense pride I felt when she graduated from college completely debt-free because I paid every single tuition bill in cash. All those years of absolute dedication meant absolutely nothing to her when placed next to the fake, glittering wealth of the Mercer family. She threw my entire legacy in the trash just to fit in with people who fundamentally despised her. She fully knew her arrogant husband was actively trying to steal my home, my hard-earned money, and my very freedom, yet she was only concerned about maintaining her fake elite social status. True forgiveness requires genuine heartfelt remorse and a fundamental recognition of the terrible, profound harm caused to an innocent victim. Jada was not crying on my floor because she realized she had deeply and unforgivably betrayed her father. She was only crying because her fraudulent, luxurious lifestyle had spectacularly exploded in her face, and she was suddenly left facing the harsh, unforgiving consequences of her own terrible, selfish actions. If Logan had successfully secured that fraudulent $2 million loan and locked me away in a secure psychiatric facility, Jada would be happily drinking vintage wine on my deck right now, completely unbothered by my permanent, devastating absence. She would have gladly spent my hard-earned money without a single shred of guilt or hesitation. Understanding that brutal, cold reality completely severed the final remaining ties of my lifelong parental obligation. A toxic, greedy parasite does not magically deserve warm shelter just because the host. It tried to aggressively kill, finally fought back, and won the battle. I had spent my entire life being a reliable, sturdy provider, but I absolutely refused to be a convenient, disposable safety net for a greedy, ungrateful traitor who sold my life for a pair of designer shoes. Jada remained crumpled pathetically on the floor, sobbing violently into her hands while Richard and Patricia continued to glare at her with absolute, undisguised disgust. Before I could instruct my private security team to physically remove the remaining hostile Mercers from my private property, the heavy wooden front doors swung open once again with a loud thud. The lead tactical federal agent from the white-collar crime division stepped back into the cabin, his heavy tactical boots crunching loudly on the broken glass scattered across the rug. He completely ignored the furious glaring of the Mercer parents and walked with deliberate, aggressive purpose directly toward my daughter. Jada slowly lifted her tear-stained face, looking up at the imposing federal officer with absolute blind panic swimming in her eyes. The agent reached into the breast pocket of his heavy ballistic vest and pulled out a thick, folded legal document sealed tightly in a sturdy brown manila envelope. He held it out, dropping it unceremoniously onto the hardwood floor right next to her trembling, bleeding hands. "Jada Mercer," he announced, his booming baritone voice cutting sharply through her pathetic continuous sobs. "You are hereby formally served with a federal subpoena and immediate summons. You are officially indicted as a fully willing co-conspirator in multiple massive counts of interstate wire fraud and severe banking deception. Your personal signature is undeniably present on several forged commercial loan applications, and you are legally commanded to appear in federal court to answer for these federal felony charges." The federal agent did not offer a single ounce of sympathy to the weeping woman on the floor. He simply stated that failure to appear would result in an immediate federal bench warrant for her physical arrest. Patricia and Richard watched the scene unfold, with stunned silence, finally realizing that the federal government was actively targeting absolutely everyone involved in their massive financial conspiracy. Jada stared at the thick brown envelope resting on the glass shards as if it were a highly unstable explosive device, perfectly realizing her entire life was completely and utterly destroyed beyond any hope of repair. Jada was entirely trapped with absolutely no way out and nobody left to save her from the inevitable ruin she had created. 3 months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open to a room packed tightly with eager reporters, aggressive federal prosecutors, and nervous spectators. I sat in the front row wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit projecting the absolute immovable strength of a man who had already won the war. Across the polished center aisle sat Logan Mercer. The arrogant, tailored finance director who had violently kicked open my cabin door was completely gone. In his place sat a gaunt, trembling shell of a man wearing an ill-fitting, bright orange prison jumpsuit. His expensive haircut had grown out into a messy, greasy tangle, and the deep, dark circles under his terrified eyes spoke volumes about his miserable time in federal holding. He nervously bounced his chained legs under the heavy defense table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the gallery. Jada sat 2 rows behind him, looking utterly exhausted, completely isolated, and entirely broken. Patricia and Richard Mercer were nowhere to be seen, having cowardly fled the state the exact moment their own corporate bankruptcy proceedings began. The federal judge walked into the courtroom, his black robes flowing behind him, commanding immediate and absolute silence. The time for cheap manipulation, arrogant entitlement, and empty threats was officially over. It was time for the final, undeniable execution of justice. The defense attorney, a highly expensive corporate shark who had undoubtedly demanded his massive retainer and untraceable cash, stood up and immediately launched into a pathetic, desperate performance. He paced back and forth in front of the jury box, trying to paint his client as a tragic, naive victim of a vindictive and deeply prejudiced father-in-law. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney projected his voice booming across the silent room. "Logan Mercer is not a criminal mastermind. He is a desperate young family man who was brutally manipulated and actively entrapped by a highly sophisticated, ruthless corporate predator." He pointed a dramatic, accusatory finger directly at my chest. "Miles Jackson harbors a deep-seated personal hatred for his white son-in-law. He used his massive hidden wealth and invisible corporate resources to lay a highly complex trap, intentionally driving this young man into a state of severe financial panic just to utterly destroy him for personal revenge. He claimed I had purposely hidden my wealth to make Logan feel responsible for my estate. It was a completely absurd and highly insulting defense strategy, but it was the absolute only pathetic card they had left to play. Logan sat at the table nodding vigorously, trying to look like a broken martyr. I did not flinch or show a single ounce of outrage at the blatant public accusation. I simply looked over at Sullivan, who was casually adjusting his silk tie with a look of supreme predatory amusement. Sullivan stood up, addressing the judge with absolute clinical precision. "Your Honor, the defense is attempting to weave a fictional narrative of racial and class entrapment to distract from the cold, hard digital reality of premeditated federal fraud. My client did not forge his own medical records. My client did not actively solicit a $2 million commercial loan under false pretenses. And my client certainly did not hold a gun to the defendant's head, forcing him to illegally sell a classic vehicle to a known criminal across state lines." Sullivan walked over to the evidence table and picked up a thick stack of printed bank statements, holding them up for the entire jury to see. The defendant acted with complete malicious autonomy, motivated entirely by his own reckless greed and his desperate need to maintain a fraudulent high society lifestyle. He willingly and aggressively exploited a man he believed was a helpless elderly target. The defense attorney immediately objected, claiming the financial records were purely circumstantial and aggressively demanding proof of Logan's direct malicious intent. He arrogantly insisted that Logan genuinely believed he had the legal right to manage the estate and was simply trying to help a deteriorating old man. The audacity of the lie hung heavily in the courtroom, but Sullivan simply smiled a terrifying shark-like grin. He turned to the judge and formally requested permission to submit Exhibit 42 into the official public record. As the court technicians set up the advanced audio equipment, I sat perfectly still, remembering the relentless, grueling work of the past 3 months. While Logan sat rotting in a maximum security federal holding cell, desperately waiting for a bail hearing that never came, I was actively working hand in hand with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had completely opened my corporate ledgers and granted Special Agent Vance absolute unrestricted access to my highly advanced security servers. We did not just build a basic criminal case, we meticulously constructed an impenetrable titanium vault of undeniable evidence. We tracked every single fraudulent wire transfer, every single bounced corporate check, and every single illegal signature directly back to Logan's personal encrypted devices. I used my extensive corporate network to uncover the dark web proxy servers he used to hire the corrupt Dr. Eris Thorne, who had already accepted a brutal plea deal and agreed to testify directly against Logan to save himself from a maximum sentence. We completely dismantled his entire financial ecosystem, tracing the toxic debt back to the exact moment he realized his retail investment fund was violently collapsing. I spent countless hours in sterile, bright interrogation rooms helping the federal prosecutors connect the complex digital dots. I refused to leave a single legal loophole or a single shadow of a doubt for any expensive defense attorney to exploit. The buyer of Corinne's classic Mustang had also flipped, providing written testimony that Logan bragged about stealing the car from his senile father-in-law. I ensured that when this specific day finally arrived, Logan would have absolutely nowhere left to hide and no one left to blame but his own toxic, overwhelming greed. The courtroom speakers crackled to life, cutting sharply through the tense, suffocating silence. Sullivan hit the play button on his laptop, broadcasting the high-definition audio file I had secretly captured from the hidden microphone inside my freezing storage shed. Logan's arrogant, aggressive voice echoed loudly across the expansive federal courtroom, completely destroying any illusion of his innocence. The recording captured the exact moment he had stormed into the shed to demand the gate code, completely unaware he was speaking directly into a military-grade surveillance grid. "You are completely delusional," the recorded voice of Logan sneered, dripping with venom and undeniable malice. "You are making up fake corporate zoning laws because you are desperate to hold on to whatever little power you think you have left." The audio continued, capturing his exact unprompted confession of the entire premeditated crime. "I have the signed deed to the cabin and the property lines fully mapped out. I used the power of attorney Jada got you to sign in the hospital. You are just a broke, pathetic old fool, and I am taking everything." Logan sat at the defense table, completely paralyzed. The color rapidly drained from his face as he heard his own distinct voice actively mocking the man he was trying to steal from and openly bragging about exploiting the forged documents. The expensive defense attorney dropped his gold pen onto the wooden table, effectively realizing his entire elaborate entrapment narrative was instantly and permanently destroyed. The jury stared at Logan with absolute unfiltered disgust. The federal judge, a stern, uncompromising man with zero tolerance for arrogant white-collar criminals, leaned forward and slammed his heavy wooden gavel down hard. The deafening crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, officially signaling the absolute unavoidable end of Logan Mercer's entire life. The courtroom held its collective breath as the heavy wooden gavel struck the block for the final time. The sharp sound echoed like a definitive period at the end of a very long and violent sentence. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours, a remarkably short amount of time that spoke volumes about the sheer, undeniable clarity of the evidence we presented. Logan stood up from the defense table, his chained hands trembling uncontrollably as the foreperson stood to read the verdict. The suffocating tension in the room was absolute. Even the aggressive federal prosecutors remained perfectly still, watching the final destruction of an arrogant corporate criminal, guilty on all 12 counts of interstate wire fraud. Guilty on 3 counts of severe identity theft. Guilty on the interstate trafficking of stolen goods and gross elder abuse. Each word landed like a physical blow, striking Logan directly in the chest. His expensive defense attorney stared blankly at his notes, completely defeated by the digital reality of his client's profound stupidity. The federal judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses and staring down at Logan with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. The time for pathetic excuses was officially over. "Logan Mercer," the judge began, his booming voice leaving absolutely no room for mercy or negotiation. "You actively weaponized your corporate background to orchestrate a predatory and highly calculated scheme against a man you deemed vulnerable. You forged legal medical documents and attempted to steal millions of dollars to fund a pathetic illusion of wealth. You are a profound danger to the financial ecosystem and a disgrace to society. I hereby sentence you to 96 months in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole." Logan let out a sharp, agonizing gasp, completely collapsing back into his heavy wooden chair. 8 years. He would be 42 years old by the time he took another breath, as a free man, his youth and his career entirely obliterated. The judge did not stop there. He formally ordered the immediate liquidation of all remaining Mercer family corporate holding accounts to pay the massive required federal restitution. The fake retail empire Richard and Patricia had used to bully their way through high society was officially legally demolished and auctioned off to the highest bidder for pennies on the dollar. The judge then shifted his stern gaze toward the gallery, locking directly onto Jada, who sat trembling 2 rows back. "Jada Mercer," he continued, his tone shifting from angry to clinical. "Due to your highly cooperative testimony against your husband and the clear evidence that you were actively manipulated into signing specific secondary loan documents, you are formally cleared of the primary federal conspiracy charges. You will not serve a prison sentence." Jada let out a loud, dramatic sob of relief, burying her tear-stained face in her hands. However, the judge added, raising his voice slightly to cut through her tears, "You are still fully legally bound to the joint financial accounts you willingly opened under your marital name. The court is completely unsympathetic to your aggressive financial negligence. You are personally responsible for the remaining $500,000 in outstanding corporate credit card debt your husband accrued. You are ordered to begin immediate mandatory restitution payments, Failure to comply will result in severe wage garnishment and total asset seizure. Jada froze completely, the loud sob catching in her throat. She had actively avoided a federal prison cell, but she was now chained to a massive, unpayable mountain of toxic debt. She lost her husband, her home, her fake elite status, and any hope of a normal financial future in a single devastating stroke of a gavel. Jada completely failed to comprehend the absolute brutality of American financial law when she eagerly signed those joint credit applications. During the height of their fake wealthy lifestyle, Logan had easily convinced her to co-sign massive premium corporate credit lines to secure better interest rates and exclusive travel perks. She gladly put her legal name on those documents, completely blinded by the glittering illusion of unlimited spending power. She happily swiped those metallic cards to buy designer handbags, expensive European vacations, and lavish country club memberships, never once questioning the source of the capital. She thought money was an infinite resource tied to her new last name. The federal legal system does not care about your hurt feelings or your sudden claim of profound ignorance. Joint debt means shared total liability. The $500,000 Logan spent trying to save his failing retail investment fund and maintain their fake rich facade was now resting entirely on her shoulders. Because the massive debt was intrinsically tied to federal fraud charges and criminal restitution mandates, it was completely exempt from standard bankruptcy protection. She could not simply file for Chapter 7 and walk away clean. That $500,000 anchor would ruthlessly follow her for the rest of her natural life. It would actively drain her future paychecks, destroy her credit score, and guarantee she would never own a home or secure a decent loan again. She eagerly traded the solid debt-free foundation I built for her for a fleeting moment of fake high society validation. Now she was completely enslaved by the exact financial system she had so arrogantly tried to manipulate to destroy her own father. The federal bailiffs aggressively hauled Logan away through the side doors, his heavy chains rattling loudly against the polished floorboards. He did not look back at his wife. He did not offer a final apology or a single word of comfort. He just kept his head down, staring at the floor as his 8-year nightmare officially began. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving Jada sitting entirely alone on the wooden bench, surrounded by the crushing reality of her absolute ruin. I stood up, buttoned my custom-tailored suit jacket, and walked calmly up the center aisle, completely ignoring her soft, pathetic whimpers. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, taking a deep, satisfying breath of clean, crisp air. The intense legal battle was finally over, and absolute victory belonged entirely to me. I walked down the wide concrete steps toward the street where my private driver was already waiting with the engine running on my black luxury sedan. As I reached the bottom step, I heard the frantic clicking of cheap heels on the pavement behind me. Jada burst out of the courthouse doors, her hair a mess and her eyes red from crying. She had absolutely nothing left in this world. The Mercer family had abandoned her. Her husband was locked in a federal cage, and her bank accounts were permanently frozen by the federal government. She was completely penniless, completely homeless, and completely terrified of the future. She stood on the sidewalk, shivering in the cold wind, looking desperately at my vehicle. She slowly walked toward my car, her hands clasped together in a pathetic begging gesture, waiting for me to open the door and rescue her from the absolute ruins of her own life. I reached the polished black door of my waiting luxury sedan, the sleek metal reflecting the harsh afternoon sun piercing through the city skyline. My private driver stood ready, holding the door handle with absolute professional precision, waiting to whisk me back to the quiet sanctuary of my mountain estate. Before I could step inside the comfortable leather interior, the frantic clicking of cheap heels on the hard concrete echoed loudly behind me, breaking the peaceful rhythm of my departure. Jada threw her exhausted body violently between me and the open car door, her hands pressed flat against the tinted glass as if she could physically stop me from leaving her behind. Her expensive designer clothes were thoroughly rumpled and deeply stained with tears. Her immaculate makeup was completely ruined by hours of hysterical crying inside the tense federal courtroom. She looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, highly entitled woman who had marched into my cabin just 3 months ago, demanding my immediate eviction. "Dad, please wait," she hyperventilated, her voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic rasp that drew the attention of passing pedestrians. "The federal bank took the luxury condo this morning. I have absolutely zero money left to my name and nowhere to sleep tonight. Please, just let me come back to the cabin with you. I promise I will do whatever you want. I will clean the hardwood floors." I will cook your meals. I will earn my keep. Just please take me home. I stood perfectly still on the busy city sidewalk, completely unfazed by her dramatic public breakdown. Suit-clad lawyers and court officials glanced in our direction, but I did not care about the public spectacle she was creating. I looked down at the weeping woman blocking my path, feeling absolutely no parental urge to comfort her or solve her self-inflicted massive crisis. That cabin is my private home, Jada. I stated, my voice dangerously calm and utterly devoid of any warmth. It is not a homeless shelter for convicted federal accomplices, and it is certainly not a convenient backup plan for a traitor who actively tried to destroy my entire life. She gasped violently, tears streaming endlessly down her face, and grabbed the tailored sleeve of my custom jacket. "Dad, it was all Logan," she cried out, desperately trying to shift the entire weight of her guilt onto her imprisoned husband. "He lied to me about everything. He manipulated my signature on those banking documents. I did not know how truly evil his financial plan was. I just wanted us to be a successful, powerful family." I reached out and firmly removed her trembling hand from my suit, smoothing the expensive fabric with cold, clinical precision. "Do not insult my intelligence by playing the innocent, naive victim right now," I replied sharply, cutting completely through her pathetic wall of excuses. "You stood in my freezing storage shed and handed me cold leftover pancakes like I was a stray dog. You looked me dead in the eye and demanded I sacrifice my hard-earned property so your arrogant husband could pay off his massive hidden gambling debts. You only care that Logan is a dangerous criminal because he got caught and you lost access to the stolen money. If he had successfully stolen my $2 million equity and locked me away in a secure psychiatric ward, you would be happily spending my cash on a designer vacation in Europe right this exact second without a single thought about my miserable existence in a padded room." Jada shrank back against the side of the car as if I had physically struck her across the face. She knew my assessment was absolutely brutally accurate and impossible to deny. "But I am your daughter," she whined, repeating the only meaningless card she had left to play in this desperate game. "I am your own flesh and blood. You cannot just leave me out here on the cold street to starve. You are a father. You are supposed to protect me unconditionally." I stared at her tear-stained face, and my mind immediately drifted back to a quiet, sterile hospital room exactly 5 years ago. I was sitting tightly beside Karina's bed, holding her frail, delicate hand as the aggressive cancer slowly and ruthlessly took her away from me. We both knew the end was imminent, and we were sharing our final honest truths before she passed. Corinne had always possessed a sharp, piercing intuition about people, especially regarding the deep flaws of our own daughter. She looked at me with her tired, beautiful eyes and gave me one final crucial piece of advice that I had foolishly ignored until this very definitive moment. "Miles," she had whispered, her voice weak but carrying the immense weight of absolute certainty, "you have always worked way too hard to give Jada the entire world, but you cannot simply buy a person a solid moral compass. She is completely consumed by a desperate, endless need for superficial validation from people who do not matter. When I am gone, do not let your deep grief turn you into a blind financial enabler. Unconditional love does not mean endlessly funding someone else's toxic greed, and family loyalty does not mean allowing yourself to be actively destroyed by your own blood. If she ever fully chooses darkness and betrays our values, you must find the incredible strength to close the heavy door and let her face the freezing cold." I had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to avoid that harsh reality, burying my head in the sand and throwing massive amounts of money at her problems, hoping she would eventually mature into a decent human being. But Corinne was entirely right. Jada had completely surrendered to the toxic, superficial rot of the Mercer family, and no amount of my hard-earned money was ever going to magically fix her deeply corrupted character. She had crossed a fatal boundary that could never be uncrossed. I focused my sharp attention back on the broken woman sobbing frantically on the concrete sidewalk. The blinding clarity of Corinne's final warning completely shielded my heart from any lingering emotional manipulation. "You eagerly chose a life of fake luxury and ruthless deceit over the father who loved and provided for you," I said, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a federal judge reading a permanent death sentence. "You desperately wanted to play high-stakes corporate games with arrogant financial predators, and now you have to pay the ultimate devastating price for losing that game." Jada fell heavily to her knees on the dirty pavement, her hands clasped tightly together in a final pathetic begging gesture. "Dad, please please, what am I supposed to do now?" she wailed, her voice echoing loudly off the tall concrete buildings surrounding us. I looked down at her completely empty-handed and utterly ruined by her own massive greed. I vividly remembered the exact arrogant words Logan had used when he first kicked open my cabin door demanding I make room for his terrible family. I remembered the calm, simple phrase I had offered him in return, right before they unleashed this massive, catastrophic war against me. "Pack your bags, Jada," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, razor-sharp whisper. She looked up at me in sheer total confusion, her heavy tears stopping for a fraction of a second. "But I do not have any bags left," she choked out, her voice shaking violently in the wind. "The federal bank literally took everything I own." I offered her a single cold and completely unsympathetic smile, looking down at her ruined designer shoes. "Then I highly suggest you start walking," I replied, turning my back on her forever. I stepped smoothly into the luxurious leather interior of my waiting sedan, and my private driver immediately closed the heavy solid door, sealing me safely inside my fortress. The thick tinted window slowly rolled up, completely silencing her frantic, desperate screams from the outside world. The powerful engine roared to life, and the vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the busy city traffic, leaving Jada Mercer entirely alone to rot on the cold, unforgiving sidewalk. The long drive back up the winding mountain road was the most peaceful journey I had experienced in months. My private driver navigated the heavy luxury sedan smoothly around the sharp curves, leaving the toxic noise and the concrete aggression of the city far behind us. We passed through the lower security gate, the exact same fortified checkpoint where Logan had violently lost his mind trying to force his way through just weeks ago. The armed private security guards offered a respectful, crisp nod as we rolled slowly past their reinforced station. As we pulled into the long, crushed gravel driveway of my expansive estate, the profound silence of the mountain welcomed me like an old familiar friend. The chaotic swarm of aggressive luxury vehicles and the loud, obnoxious shouting of the deeply entitled Mercer family were completely gone, erased as if they had never existed. The heavy lingering scent of cheap designer cologne and burnt premium catering food had been entirely scrubbed clean by the crisp, high-altitude wind blowing through the towering pines. I stepped out of the warm leather interior of the vehicle and stood entirely alone on the pristine leveled driveway, looking up at the massive custom-built oak cabin. It stood tall, solid, and completely unbothered by the pathetic temporary invasion it had recently endured. The massive wooden beams and the hand-carved stone chimney projected an aura of absolute permanence. The sanctuary was finally officially mine again, and the foul presence of those greedy parasites had been entirely eradicated from my sacred ground. I walked up the wide wooden steps to the expansive wraparound porch, my heavy work boots thudding solidly and rhythmically against the thick, treated timber. I stopped directly in front of the heavy main double doors and stared at the sleek, flashing digital smart lock Logan had arrogantly installed to lock me out of my own home in the freezing cold. Its glowing red keypad felt like a disgusting technological parasite clinging desperately to the beautiful natural wood I had personally selected, milled, and stained 2 decades ago. I did not bother punching in a master code to bypass his pathetic, vulnerable system. I walked around the perimeter of the deck to the side of the house, entered through the utilitarian mudroom, and walked straight to my heavy-duty tool chest. I grabbed a thick, heavy steel crowbar, a high-powered cordless drill, and a specialized set of metal extractors. I marched back to the front porch with absolute cold, focused determination burning in my chest. I wedged the freezing solid steel tip of the heavy crowbar directly underneath the cheap plastic housing of Logan's modern digital lock, and applied a sudden, brutal surge of downward mechanical force. The expensive piece of supposed high-security technology cracked loudly and snapped completely off the wooden doorframe, exposing the cheap, bare internal wiring underneath. I tossed the broken electronic garbage forcefully over the high wooden railing, letting it smash into a dozen useless plastic pieces on the hard-packed dirt below. It was a highly satisfying, violent physical purge of the lingering Mercer infection that had stained my property. I reached deep into my heavy canvas tool bag and pulled out the original solid brass mechanical deadbolt I had removed years ago when I first foolishly upgraded the security system. It was incredibly heavy, freezing cold to the touch, and totally completely reliable, requiring a physical solid key to manually turn the heavy internal steel tumblers. I spent the next solid hour meticulously installing the solid brass mechanism, drilling the thick, long steel screws deep into the reinforced solid oak frame of the heavy door. I turned the heavy metal key, feeling the deeply satisfying solid mechanical clunk of the thick deadbolt locking securely and permanently into place. There were no flashing digital lights, no vulnerable wireless networks to easily hack, and no convenient digital access codes for arrogant, entitled thieves to manipulate from afar. It was a pure, impenetrable physical barrier that could only be bypassed with my explicit physical permission. The house was officially permanently secured against the outside world. I walked into my private study, a quiet, temperature-controlled room lined from floor to ceiling with heavy wooden bookshelves and massive rolled architectural blueprints from my long, highly successful corporate career. I sat down heavily at my large, polished mahogany desk and opened my thick, expensive leather briefcase, taking out a thick stack of crisp, legally binding documents Sullivan had meticulously prepared for me earlier that morning. They were the final, uncompromising execution papers for my vast personal commercial estate, officially transferring every single lucrative asset, property deed, and highly profitable corporate trust out of Jada's name permanently and forever. For my entire adult life, I had operated under the heavy, exhausting, completely suffocating burden of extreme parental financial obligation. I had tirelessly hoarded my massive accumulated wealth, building an impenetrable financial fortress strictly to ensure my daughter would never have to face the harsh, brutal economic struggles I endured growing up with absolutely nothing. I sincerely thought passing down massive generational wealth was the ultimate, undeniable expression of a loyal father's profound, unconditional love. But as I signed my legal name in thick black ink across the final formal page, officially redirecting tens of millions of dollars to the Jackson Foundation for Orphaned Youth, I felt a massive, suffocating physical weight lift entirely and completely off my tired shoulders. I was finally completely, undeniably free. I was no longer a convenient host organism for a greedy, ungrateful, toxic parasite who viewed my ultimate demise as her personal lottery ticket. The millions of dollars I bled and sweat to aggressively earn would go directly toward funding full-ride, expensive college scholarships for young, brilliant black men and women who possessed the actual raw drive and solid moral character my own daughter completely, totally lacked. I was actively building a brand new, powerful legacy, one based firmly on genuine academic merit and fierce, unyielding determination, instead of shallow, useless entitlement and toxic high society validation. I closed the thick leather binder, feeling a profound, absolute, unbreakable sense of peace settle permanently over my tired soul. The late afternoon sun began to dip slowly below the towering evergreen pine trees, casting long, deep, dark shadows across the expansive, pristine property. The temperature dropped rapidly, biting through the fabric of my clothes, but I felt completely warm and entirely alive inside. I left the comfortable, heated cabin and walked slowly down the familiar, winding dirt path toward the cold, detached storage shed where I had meticulously engineered the total, devastating destruction of the entire Mercer family. The heavy wooden door creaked open loudly, revealing the dark, dusty, utilitarian interior. The makeshift, uncomfortable cardboard bed was still sitting pathetically in the far corner, surrounded by the heavy, humming server racks and the false wooden security wall I had built. I began breaking down the flattened cardboard boxes and systematically gathering the old, heavy moving blankets, intending to completely, thoroughly erase any lingering physical evidence of my temporary, humiliating exile. As I lifted the heavy plastic storage bin to slide it back into its proper place, a small, square, heavy object slipped out from beneath the thick canvas tarp and fell softly onto the hard, cold concrete floor, making a gentle tapping sound. I slowly knelt down, my joints popping slightly in the cold air, and picked up the small, solid silver picture frame. It was the absolute only personal, sentimental item I had managed to secretly sneak into the freezing shed when Logan aggressively locked me out in the bitter cold. It was an old, faded, beautiful photograph of Corinne taken during our very first summer on this exact mountain, long before the massive cabin was even fully built. She was smiling brightly at the camera, her natural hair blowing wildly and freely in the mountain wind, looking incredibly happy and utterly at peace with the world. Logan had carelessly, violently kicked this exact plastic bin during his explosive temper tantrum in the shed, nearly shattering the fragile glass protecting her beautiful, smiling face. I wiped a thin layer of gray dust from the smooth, cold glass, staring deeply at the woman who had wisely warned me about absolutely everything that had just violently, forcefully transpired. I held her preserved image tightly against my chest, feeling a sudden, overwhelming, completely unexpected surge of powerful, deep emotion. The brutal, highly calculated corporate war was entirely over. The aggressive, greedy enemies were completely, utterly vanquished. But a new, profound, emotional truth was about to reveal itself entirely in the total silence of the setting mountain sun. The early morning sun crested over the jagged mountain peaks, painting the sprawling valley in brilliant shades of deep orange and soft purple. The biting cold of the mountain air was crisp and entirely refreshing, entering my lungs like a physical wave of absolute pure renewal. I stood in my quiet custom kitchen, listening to the slow, steady drip of the coffee maker filling my favorite heavy ceramic mug with pitch-black dark roast. The profound silence of the cabin was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was a beautiful welcome companion, a vast empty canvas that belonged entirely to me. I grabbed my steaming mug and walked slowly out onto the expansive wooden balcony. I sank deeply into the heavy wooden rocking chair Corinne and I had purchased together over 2 decades ago. The old wood creaked gently under my weight, a familiar, comforting sound that anchored me to the present moment. I looked out over the massive expanse of untouched nature stretching out for miles in every single direction. I remembered the days I spent cutting the timber and laying the foundation for this very deck, perfectly placing every single nail and bracket. The world was waking up completely indifferent to the massive corporate wars and the bitter human betrayals that had recently stained this sacred ground. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bitter coffee, feeling the hot liquid warm my chest. The chaotic storm had finally passed completely, and the new dawn was absolutely flawless. The deep, peaceful silence of the morning was gently interrupted by the soft buzzing of my secure cell phone resting on the small wooden side table. I glanced at the glowing screen and saw Sullivan's secure encrypted number flashing brightly. I picked up the device and answered, knowing my ruthless attorney rarely called this early unless he had a final, definitive update on our ongoing legal demolition. Sullivan greeted me with his usual crisp, professional tone, completely devoid of any unnecessary pleasantries. He called to deliver the absolute final status report on the scattered remains of the Mercer family empire. He informed me that the federal bankruptcy courts had officially seized the last remaining assets belonging to Richard and Patricia Mercer. The arrogant, fake wealthy couple who had sneered at my rustic cabin and treated me like a lowly servant had been violently evicted from their luxury city penthouse. Sullivan tracked their financial footprint and confirmed they were currently renting a tiny, dilapidated ground-floor apartment in a notoriously dangerous, impoverished neighborhood on the far east side of the city. Their fancy leased vehicles were repossessed and their elite country club memberships were permanently terminated in profound public disgrace. Patricia was reportedly working as a low-level customer service representative, taking angry phone calls from furious retail shoppers just to pay for basic groceries. Sullivan then shifted his clinical report to the current status of my former daughter. Jada had completely failed to secure any high-level corporate employment due to her massive, highly publicized federal fraud indictment and her catastrophic credit score. Sullivan proudly reported that his private investigators located her working the graveyard shift as a basic checkout cashier at a massive discount grocery store. She was forced to scan cheap generic food items under harsh buzzing fluorescent lights for minimum wage, while 100% of her disposable income was being aggressively and automatically garnished by the federal government to pay off the $500,000 debt Logan had anchored to her name. She took public transportation every single night to a tiny rented room she shared with 3 loud strangers living a life of absolute grinding poverty. She stood on her swollen feet for 10 hours a day dealing with rude customers and abusive managers, completely stripped of her designer clothes and her elite social circles. I listened to Sullivan's entire, highly detailed report without saying a single word. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy, and I certainly did not feel a single drop of lingering fatherly pity. I simply felt the cold, hard satisfaction of absolute, perfect, universal equilibrium. They had aggressively tried to steal the hard-earned fruits of my entire life, and now they were forced to choke on the bitter harvest of their own toxic greed. I thanked Sullivan for his exceptional service and calmly ended the call, setting the phone face down on the table. I leaned back in the sturdy wooden rocking chair, staring out at the gentle mist rolling slowly across the pristine mountain lake in the distance. For my entire adult life, I had operated under the completely false assumption that blood was an unbreakable sacred bond that demanded endless sacrifice and profound unconditional forgiveness. I had let my deep grief over losing Corinne blind me to the dark, undeniable reality of my daughter's toxic entitlement. I thought my ultimate duty as a father was to provide a massive, impenetrable financial shield to protect her from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the adult world. I worked 80-hour weeks negotiating brutal commercial real estate deals just to ensure she never felt the painful sting of poverty I grew up with. But I completely failed to realize that constantly shielding a person from the natural consequences of their own terrible actions only breeds a monster. True family is not defined by shared genetics or a common last name. True family is built entirely on mutual respect, deep, unwavering loyalty, and a shared foundation of solid moral integrity. Letting go of Jada was undeniably the hardest physical and emotional task I had ever endured, but it was also the most profoundly necessary action of my entire life. Respecting my own legacy and protecting the sacred memory of my late wife was infinitely more important than maintaining a deeply toxic relationship with a parasite who wore my daughter's face. My wealth was now secured entirely for the Jackson Foundation, where it would fund the brilliant futures of young, struggling students who actually deserved a fighting chance. I had finally learned the ultimate brutal lesson of my golden years. You cannot ever buy true love, and you cannot ever negotiate with greedy, relentless evil. You can only cut the infection out entirely and let the wound heal in the fresh, clean air. I stood up from the creaking rocking chair and walked over to the thick wooden railing, taking one last deep breath of the freezing mountain pine air. I left the empty ceramic coffee mug on the small side table and walked down the wide wooden steps toward the dirt path leading directly to the private lake. I grabbed my old, worn fishing rod from the side of the house, feeling the familiar rough cork handle slip perfectly into my palm. I walked slowly down the winding trail, the morning dew soaking the bottom of my heavy canvas coveralls and dampening my leather boots. I reached the long wooden dock that stretched far out into the clear water. The surface of the lake was absolutely perfectly still, reflecting the towering green pines and the bright blue sky like a massive, flawless mirror. I checked the strong nylon line, attached a small, simple silver lure, and cast it far out into the deep, freezing water with a smooth, practiced motion. The small splash broke the perfect reflection, sending tiny, gentle ripples outward in perfect concentric circles. I stood there completely alone on the wooden dock, feeling the solid, sturdy earth beneath my boots and the warm morning sun finally breaking through the trees to hit my face. There were no more arrogant shouts demanding my attention or trying to force me out of my own home. There were no more fake smiles hiding malicious criminal intent. The massive corporate wars were permanently over, and the greedy, ruthless invaders were utterly vanquished and locked in their respective cages. The undeniable natural order of my universe had been completely and violently restored. I watched the small colored bobber float peacefully on the calm surface, waiting patiently for a bite, while the mountain birds began to sing their morning songs. Absolute perfect peace belongs only to those who possess the profound courage to ruthlessly defend it. My name is Miles Jackson, and my sanctuary is finally unconditionally mine. The most profound lesson I took away from this entire ordeal is that true power never needs to announce itself. Arrogance always mistakes silence for weakness and humility for ignorance. Logan and the Mercer family looked at my age, my race, and my quiet lifestyle and instantly assumed I was a helpless target they could easily consume. They relied entirely on loud boasts and superficial status, while I relied on decades of genuine hard work and calculated patience. True strength is built in the shadows through resilience and grit, not bought on credit to impress strangers. Never underestimate the quiet ones. If you enjoyed my story, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below.